There was a morning, ordinary in every way that mattered, when a farmer in the valley of the Euphrates walked to the edge of his irrigation channel and found nothing. Not a trickle, not a puddle, not even the wet gleam of mud that tells you water passed this way yesterday. Just earth. Pale, cracked, hungry earth. He would have stood there for a long time. We don't know his name. We don't know if he had children waiting at home, or debts owed to the temple granary, or prayers he'd been meaning to say. What we know is what the archaeology tells us, that within a generation of that morning, his civilization was gone. History teaches us that civilizations fall for reasons we can name: invasions, corruption, political collapse, military defeat. We love those stories because they give us villains, turning points, moments of decisive failure. We can point to a battle, a betrayal, a bad emperor, a misguided policy, and say, there, that is where it ended. But some civilizations did not fall to an army or a conspiracy. They fell to the sky. More precisely, they fell to the absence of what the sky refused to give them: water. This is the story of what happens when the rains stop coming. It is not a metaphor. It is not a parable dressed up as archaeology. It is one of the most devastating recurring patterns in human history. A pattern that erased the Akkadian Empire from the map of the world, that emptied the great cities of the Bronze Age in a single catastrophic century, that silenced the classic Maya and cracked the Tang Dynasty like a piece of overheated clay. Time after time, in places separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, the same story unfolded. A civilization built its identity around water: a river, a monsoon, a reliable seasonal flood, and for generations, perhaps centuries, that water came. Fields were planted, cities rose, populations doubled and then doubled again. Temples were built, trade routes established, royal dynasties legitimized, and then the water stopped. What followed was not a quick collapse. It rarely is. The human response to drought, stubborn, ingenious, desperate, and ultimately tragic, played out over years, sometimes decades, before the end finally came. Farmers dug deeper wells, administrators rationed grain stores, priests performed increasingly elaborate rituals, believing the gods had turned their faces away, and that more devotion, more sacrifice, might call the rain back. Kings sent armies to seize irrigated land that still produced, triggering wars that consumed the last of the social energy needed to hold civilization together. Ordinary people did what ordinary people have always done in impossible circumstances. They waited, they adapted, they hoped, and finally they left. The cities they left behind decayed slowly at first, then all at once. The mud brick dissolved back into the earth. The irrigation channels silted up. The orchards died, and within a generation or two, in places where tens of thousands of people had lived and worked and argued and prayed, there was only silence and sand and the patient archaeology of centuries yet to come. We are the archaeologists now, and what we have found, in the sediment cores pulled from lake beds, in the isotope ratios locked inside ancient stalagmites, in the desperation legible in the final administrative tablets of dying empires, is a story that changes how we understand the rise and fall of civilization itself. This is the year the river stopped. To understand what drought can do to a civilization, you must first understand what that civilization was. The Akkadian Empire, at its height around 2250 BCE, was something the world had never seen before. It was the first true empire in human history, a political entity that stretched from the Persian Gulf in the south to the headwaters of the Euphrates in the north, binding together dozens of previously independent city-states under a single royal authority for the first time. Its founder, Sargon of Akkad, was one of those figures who seems almost too legendary for history, a man who claimed humble origins, rose to power through military brilliance, and forged an empire through a combination of charisma, strategy, and what his contemporaries described as divine favour. Under Sargon and his successors, particularly his grandson Naram-Sin, the Akkadian Empire became the superpower of its age. Trade goods flowed into Akkadian cities from as far away as the Indus Valley and the mines of Anatolia. The empire's administrative apparatus, clay tablets in their thousands, recording grain rations, labour assignments, military provisioning and tax assessments, was sophisticated enough that modern economists have studied it for insights into early bureaucracy. Akkadian kings built on a scale that was staggering for its time. Naram-Sin declared himself a god, the first Mesopotamian king to do so, and had the title stamped on official documents and carved into mountain rock faces across the empire. His victory stele, now in the Louvre in Paris, depicts him ascending a mountain in the aftermath of battle, his soldiers climbing behind him, his enemies falling at his feet. It is one of the most confident artistic statements ever made by a human ruler, and the civilization that produced it would, within a century, be gone. The collapse when it came was swift by historical standards. Between approximately 2200 and 2050 BCE, the Akkadian Empire disintegrated. Cities were abandoned. The administrative networks that had moved grain and soldiers and tax revenues across hundreds of miles simply ceased to function. A people known to the Akkadians as the Gutians, described in their own propaganda as coming from the mountains like a swarm of locusts, moved into the power vacuum and took over what remained. For generations, scholars assumed this was primarily a political and military story. Empires overextend, succession crises weaken central authority. Outside peoples, sensing weakness, move in. This is the normal template of imperial collapse, and it fit the Akkadian case well enough that nobody looked much harder. Then, in 1993, a geologist named Harvey Weiss published a paper that changed everything. Weiss and his colleagues had been excavating a site called Tel Leilan in northeastern Syria, a major Akkadian provincial city that had been suddenly and comprehensively abandoned around 2200 BCE. When they analysed the abandonment layer, they found something that had nothing to do with military defeat or political collapse. They found a thick deposit of wind-blown dust, not the gradual accumulation of centuries of disuse, a sudden, dramatic layer of aeolian sediment, the kind that forms when the topsoil dries out and blows away, when the vegetation that held it in place dies, when the rain that fed that vegetation stops falling. Weiss cross-referenced this finding with sediment cores from the Gulf of Oman, far to the south, where a team of marine geologists had independently found a massive spike in airborne dust particles dated to almost exactly the same period. The dust was coming from the same region, northern Mesopotamia, the agricultural heartland of the Akkadian Empire. The implication was staggering. A major, sustained drought had struck the Akkadian Empire around 2200 BCE, at the very moment the empire collapsed. Subsequent research confirmed and deepened Weiss's findings. Analysis of a stalagmite from Kunef Cave in Oman, one of those extraordinary natural time capsules that record rainfall in their very chemistry, showed a dramatic reduction in monsoon precipitation beginning around 2200 BCE and lasting for approximately 3 centuries. Pollen records from lake sediments across the region showed a sharp decline in plant cover at the same time. What had happened to the Akkadian Empire was not primarily a military catastrophe. It was an environmental one. The civilization had been built on the reliable rainfall and river flow of a particular climatic regime. That regime shifted, dramatically and with catastrophic speed, and the empire it had sustained could not adapt quickly enough to survive. The Akkadians themselves seem to have understood this. A text known to scholars as the Curse of Agad, written in the aftermath of the collapse, describes the gods withdrawing their favour from the empire's capital city. The great god Enlil, angered by Naram-Sin's hubris in attacking one of his temples, sends against Akkad the people of the mountains. But before that, the text describes something else. It describes the agricultural plenty that characterised Akkad at its peak, the filled granaries, the overflowing harvest, and then, in a series of devastating reversals, it describes everything stopping. The large arable tracts yielded no grain, the text records. The inundated tracts yielded no fish. The irrigated orchards yielded no syrup or wine. The gathered clouds did not rain. The masgurum did not grow. Whatever masgurum was, scholars debate it. The sense is unmistakable. The crops failed. The water stopped. The abundance that had defined Akkadian civilization, that had made Naram-Sin's empire possible, simply wasn't there anymore. And without it, nothing else could hold. The administrative system that had distributed food across hundreds of miles required surplus food to distribute. When the surplus disappeared, the system had nothing to move, and no incentive to keep moving. The military that had enforced the empire's authority required feeding. Hungry soldiers are unreliable soldiers. The trade networks that had brought in luxury goods from distant lands required Akkadian goods to offer in exchange. When the agricultural base collapsed, the exchange goods disappeared with it. It all unraveled at once, in the way that complex interdependent systems do when a foundational input is suddenly removed. Within a generation of the Drought's onset, the Akkadian Empire, the first empire in human history, the political achievement of a civilization at its creative peak, had ceased to exist. The cities of the northern heartland were abandoned. Tel Leilan, which had held perhaps 20,000 people at its height, was empty. It would stay empty for 300 years, 3 centuries of silence where a city had once been. When people finally returned to northern Mesopotamia and rebuilt, the world they built was different, smaller, more cautious. The grand imperial ambitions that had characterized Akkad were gone, and the climate had shifted enough that the agricultural patterns were different too. The fields that returned were not quite the same as the fields that had been abandoned. The Akkadian collapse is not just an ancient curiosity. It is, according to some climate historians, the first well-documented instance of what they call a 4.2 kiloyear event, a global climatic perturbation around 200 years ago that left evidence not just in Mesopotamia, but in Egypt, the Indus Valley and China simultaneously. The same years that saw the Akkadian Empire disintegrate also saw a prolonged drought in Old Kingdom Egypt, contributing to the collapse of the centralized pharaonic state. The Indus Valley civilization, at its peak in precisely this period, began a decline from which it would never fully recover. The world's first urban civilization, spread across thousands of miles and developing independently, all stuttered and stumbled within a few centuries of each other. The sky did not distinguish between them. What makes the Akkadian collapse so instructive is how precisely its administrative records allow us to track the decline. The cuneiform tablets from the final years of Tel Leilan and other Akkadian provincial cities are not dramatic documents. They are, if anything, aggressively mundane. Ration lists, labour assignments, grain allocations, records of what went where and how much of it. They are the bureaucratic record of an empire managing its resources. And in the final decades before the collapse, they tell a story that requires no dramatic interpretation. The numbers simply get smaller. Grain rations that were recorded at one level in the empire's strong years appear at reduced levels in the administrative records of the late 3rd millennium. The allocation per labourer drops. The number of labourers receiving rations drops. The categories of specialised workers who had previously received more generous provisions disappear from the records, the work they did no longer being funded. This is the slow arithmetic of a civilization consuming its own margins. Pre-modern agricultural systems operated on what economists call thin margins. The surplus that sustained everything beyond basic subsistence, the specialised craftsmen, the temple priests, the army, the administrators who kept the whole system running, was typically a small fraction of total production. In good years in the Akkadian heartland, perhaps 15 to 20% of the grain harvest was surplus above the subsistence needs of the farming population itself. This surplus was enough in normal times to sustain an imperial system of considerable sophistication, but it was vulnerable to small changes in yield. A 10% reduction in harvest, the kind of reduction that a drought year, even a moderate drought year, could easily produce, cut the surplus by 50 to 60%. A sustained drought that reduced yields by 20 or 30% didn't just hurt. It eliminated the surplus entirely, and then started consuming the reserves that had been accumulated in better years. The administrative records show this happening in real time. The ration reductions are the visible face of the shrinking surplus. The disappearance of categories of specialised workers is the empire making triage decisions, which functions can no longer be afforded. The reduction in large-scale building activity in the final decades of the Akkadian Empire is the granary calculus being applied to architecture. When you can't feed the workers, you don't build. The Akkadian kings were not blind to what was happening. The documentary record from this period includes multiple royal inscriptions that describe the drought's effects and the state's attempts to respond to them. Grain was redistributed from less affected regions to more severely affected ones. The imperial redistribution system working as designed, moving resources from where there was some to where there was none. But redistribution requires that there be surplus to redistribute. As the drought spread across the entire northern Mesopotamian agricultural zone, as the telltale dust layers in the sediment cores confirm it did, there were fewer and fewer regions from which surplus could be drawn. The redistribution network that was the empire's greatest adaptive tool began to run out of things to redistribute. The military response was, if anything, even more revealing of the trap the empire was in. Faced with increasing raids from highland peoples taking advantage of the weakened state, the Akkadian kings dispatched punitive expeditions. But expeditions require provisioning, and provisioning requires grain, and grain was exactly what the empire was running out of. The decision to commit military resources to defensive operations during a food crisis was not a policy error. It was an impossible choice between two existential necessities. You cannot allow your borders to collapse without military response. But military operations during a food crisis consume the food you do not have. The Akkadian kings were making decisions in the space between necessities, and there was no good option in that space. What ultimately finished the Akkadian Empire was not any single dramatic event. It was the exhaustion of adaptive capacity, the moment when the system had used up its reserves, its flexibility, its institutional ability to respond creatively to crisis, and had nothing left with which to absorb the next blow. The Gutian invasion that the Akkadian texts describe with such horror was probably less a disciplined military conquest than the opportunistic movement of highland communities into a lowland that could no longer defend itself, not because it lacked defenders, but because its defenders had not eaten adequately in too long to fight effectively. Hungry armies are not merely reduced armies. They are armies whose soldiers are individually making quiet calculations about whether to stay and fight for a state that cannot feed them or to find some other way to survive. When enough soldiers make the second choice, the state ceases to exist. This is not weakness. This is human rationality in impossible conditions. The farmer who walked away from Tel Leyland to seek food elsewhere was not betraying his civilization. He was keeping himself and his family alive. 10,000 such individual decisions, each entirely rational from the inside, added up to the depopulation of a civilization's heartland. The drought did not ask anyone to choose between loyalty and survival. It simply made survival conditional in ways that made loyalty impossible to sustain. The Linear B tablets recovered from Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns and Knossos, the palace archives of the Mycenaean world, are, like the Akkadian administrative documents, aggressively mundane. They record livestock inventories, textile production, land-holding patterns, labour obligations, olive oil stocks, grain yields, military equipment allocations. They are the paperwork of a civilization at work, and the tablets from Pylos's final season, the clay documents preserved by the fire that destroyed the palace, fired by accident into permanence by the catastrophe they recorded, tell a story that chills the blood. In the weeks before the palace's destruction, the Pylian administration was mobilizing for coastal defense. The tablets record the dispatch of watchers to the coast, the allocation of bronze from the palace storerooms to be made into weapons, the designation of specific communities to provide specific contingents of rowers for the naval defense. The administration was functioning with full bureaucratic sophistication in what appear to have been its final days. The tablets suggest no awareness of imminent existential doom. They suggest instead a competent state management response to a perceived threat, the kind of organized defense that the palace system had presumably mounted before against less lethal threats. The palace burned. No subsequent occupation rebuilt on the site. The enormous Linear B archive, records that constituted the institutional memory of the Pylian state, was melted to slag or preserved, paradoxically, only by the fire that destroyed the palace that housed it. The destruction of the Mycenaean writing system, the complete forgetting of Linear B, a script that would not be rediscovered and deciphered until 1952, is one of the most significant cultural losses in human history. An entire tradition of literacy was extinguished. The Greeks who eventually emerged from the Dark Ages that followed the Bronze Age collapse did not remember Linear B. They had to acquire writing anew, borrowing an alphabet from the Phoenicians in the 8th century BCE. 4 centuries of illiteracy in a civilization that had been sophisticated enough to maintain palace archives of extraordinary complexity. The drought, and the cascade of collapse it triggered, did not merely end the Mycenaean palace civilization. It erased the knowledge and the institutions that made that civilization's achievements possible, and left the survivors to rebuild from a dramatically reduced starting point. Some things, once lost, take a very long time to recover. One of the most devastating consequences of prolonged drought on ancient civilizations was what it did to theology. In every culture we have examined, the king's legitimacy was grounded in a theological narrative that connected royal authority to agricultural abundance. This connection was not coincidental or decorative, it was structural. The entire ideological architecture of ancient kingship was built on the proposition that the ruler, through divine blood, through correct ritual performance, through cosmic relationships unavailable to ordinary humans, was the guarantor of the natural conditions on which everyone's survival depended. The Maya formulation was the most explicit. The king was the axis mundi, the centre of the world, whose body was the meeting point between the supernatural and the natural realms. His bloodletting rituals, his astronomical observations, his performance of the correct calendar ceremonies at the correct moments, these were not theatre. They were the mechanism by which the rain came, by which the maize grew, by which the world continued. A Maya king whose fields were producing was a king whose theology was verified in the most tangible possible way. A Maya king whose fields were failing, year after year as the drought deepened, was a king whose claims to cosmic authority were being empirically disproven in front of everyone. The political consequences of theological failure were severe and operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the elite level, failed theology delegitimized the specific dynasty performing the failed rituals and created space for rival claimants to argue that different royal blood, different ritual specialists, different ceremonial approaches would restore divine favor. The intensifying elite warfare of the late classic Maya period was, in significant part, a competition to claim theological authority in a context where that authority had become dangerously available, because the current holders of it were manifestly failing to deliver the rain. At the popular level, the failure of the king's theological claims created what we might call a crisis of meaning. If the king could not make it rain, what was the king for? The enormous labour investment that classic Maya subjects had devoted to temple construction, to agricultural tribute, to military service, all of it had been predicated on the proposition that this investment was cosmically necessary, that the king's ability to maintain the cosmic order required this support, and that the cosmic order, maintained, would provide the rainfall that sustained everyone. When the rainfall did not come despite the support, the bargain looked different. The labour had been paid, the return was not being delivered. The Akkadian parallel is illuminating here. The Curse of Agade text, written in the aftermath of the empire's collapse, frames the abandonment of Akkad in explicitly theological terms. The gods have withdrawn their favour, the city is cursed, the cosmic order has been violated by Naram-Sin's hubris. This is the theological narrative of collapse, an explanation of the disaster in terms that make sense within the existing belief system. But notice what this narrative does. It relocates the failure from the climate to the king. The drought becomes divine punishment for royal impiety. The king failed the cosmic relationship. The cosmic relationship responded with agricultural failure. This narrative is, from a certain angle, actually protective of the theology itself. The gods are still in control, still responding to human behaviour, still operating according to the principles of cosmic justice. It's the king, not the system, that has failed. The problem is that this solution, new king, new dynasty, divine favour restored, only works if the new dynasty can actually deliver improved harvests. If the drought continues under the new dynasty, the theological explanation fails again, and successive failures of the theological promise eventually produce what historians call a legitimacy crisis, a condition in which the entire basis for ruling authority is questioned, not just the specific dynasty that happens to be ruling. The Tang Dynasty's loss of the mandate of heaven, the collapse of Old Kingdom pharaonic power, the fragmentation of Maya authority. All of these are, at their deepest level, legitimacy crises triggered by the failure of the most fundamental royal promise, that correct royal behaviour would ensure the sky's cooperation. The sky did not cooperate, and what the sky refused to give, no king could manufacture. The late Bronze Age Mediterranean was something remarkable, the world's first truly international order. Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was a network of interconnected civilizations operating at a level of complexity and interdependence that would not be seen again for thousands of years. Egypt under Ramesses II communicated by cuneiform inscribed tablet with the Hittite Empire of Anatolia, its former enemy, now its diplomatic partner under the terms of what may be the world's oldest surviving peace treaty. Mycenaean Greek palace administrators kept meticulous records of grain, wool, and olive oil flowing through redistribution networks of extraordinary sophistication. Ugarit, a cosmopolitan trading city on the Syrian coast, hosted merchants from Cyprus, Egypt, the Aegean, Canaan, and Mesopotamia simultaneously. It was a world of palace economies and long-distance trade, of diplomatic marriages and international letters, of tin from Afghanistan being mixed with copper from Cyprus to make the bronze that gave the age its name, all of it moving across thousands of miles through a system of exchange that required stability, trust, and above all, functioning agricultural surpluses to pay for everything. Then, in what archaeologists call the Catastrophe, a term remarkable for its understatement, almost everything collapsed. Between approximately 1200 and 1150 BCE, in the space of a single human lifetime, virtually every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean either collapsed entirely or was so severely disrupted that it never recovered its former complexity. The Mycenaean palace civilization vanished completely, leaving only fading memories that would eventually be transformed into the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Hittite Empire, which had contested Egypt for dominance of the Near East, disappeared from the map. Ugarit burned to the ground and was never rebuilt. The palace economies of Cyprus were destroyed. Egypt survived, but in dramatically diminished form, contracting into itself and never again projecting the power it had wielded under Rameses. For most of the 20th century, scholars attributed this catastrophe to the Sea Peoples, migrating warrior bands from the Aegean who attacked coastal cities, destroyed trade networks, and shattered the political order of the age. This explanation had the virtue of fitting the Egyptian texts, which describe in vivid and terrified detail the arrival of these invaders by land and sea. But the Sea Peoples theory has always had problems. It explains the destruction of the coastal cities tolerably well, but it cannot explain the simultaneous collapse of inland powers like the Hittites, or the abandonment of sites that were never attacked. And it raises a prior question that the theory itself cannot answer. Who were the Sea Peoples? Where did they come from? What set them in motion? Since the early 2000s, a new and compelling answer to that prior question has emerged from the climate record. Brandon Drake's 2012 analysis of high-resolution marine sediment cores from the eastern Mediterranean found dramatic evidence of a sudden aridification event beginning around 1200 BCE, a rapid shift to cooler, drier conditions that would have dramatically reduced rainfall across the entire region. Subsequent work by Brandon Drake, Brandon Ulf Buntgen, and a growing consortium of paleoclimatologists has refined this picture. The oxygen isotope records from cave formations in Turkey show a sudden drop in precipitation. Pollen records from lake sediments across Greece and Anatolia show dramatic decline in arboreal cover. The forests were dying, and grain yields, the foundation of every Bronze Age palace economy, would have fallen dramatically. Here is the terrible arithmetic of ancient agricultural civilizations. The palace systems of the late Bronze Age operated on very thin margins. The grain that fed the palace administrators, the specialized craftsmen who made the luxury goods, the soldiers who protected the trade routes, the sailors who crewed the merchant ships, all of it was generated by an agricultural surplus that was large enough to sustain this complexity only in good years. In bad years, in drought years, the surplus disappeared, and when the surplus disappeared, the system had nothing to redistribute. Craftsmen and administrators who didn't grow their own food began to starve. Soldiers who weren't being paid in grain deserted. Trade networks that depended on agricultural goods for their export value collapsed. The whole interlocking structure of interdependence that had made the late Bronze Age possible came apart simultaneously across the entire region. What the evidence now suggests is this: the drought of 1200 BCE did not merely weaken the Bronze Age civilizations, it created the conditions for a catastrophic cascade. Farming communities unable to feed themselves through their local agricultural systems began to move, seeking food elsewhere. Some of these migrants became the Sea Peoples, dispossessed populations of Greeks, Anatolians, and Aegean islanders, driven from their homes by crop failure and famine, now moving as armed bands because armed bands were more likely to survive than hungry refugees. They attacked the coastal cities not because they were conquerors with imperial ambitions, but because they were desperate people who needed what those cities contained: food. And the cities they attacked were already weakened, their surpluses depleted, their administrative systems strained, their populations suffering from the same drought that had set the sea peoples in motion in the first place. A single letter survives from Ugarit's final days. It was found in a kiln. It had been placed there to be fired and made permanent, and the kiln was never opened because the city was destroyed before the firing was complete. The letter, sent by the king of Ugarit to the king of Al-Ashir in Cyprus, reads, "My father, now the ships of the enemy have come. They have been setting fire to my cities and have done harm to the land. Does my father not know that all my infantry and chariots are stationed in Hatti, and that all my ships are stationed in Lucca? They have not arrived back yet, so the land is thus prostrate." The letter was never sent. Ugarit was burning as it was being written. No city was ever rebuilt on the site of Ugarit. The burning left a layer of ash and charred timber that archaeologists can still identify 32 centuries later. But the city beneath the ash, the city that had hosted merchants from a dozen nations, that had been a jewel of the Bronze Age international order, was already struggling before the torches were lit. The drought had come first. The sea peoples came after. And in the terrible mathematics of civilizational collapse, the distinction matters enormously. The drought didn't just cause the collapse, it loaded the gun. The migrations, the attacks, the political disintegration, these were how the gun fired. The world that emerged from the Bronze Age catastrophe was dramatically different from the world that preceded it. The palace economies were gone. The international trading networks were gone. The complex administrative systems were gone. The art of writing itself, Linear B, the Mycenaean administrative script, was lost in Greece, not to be reinvented for 4 centuries. The population of the Aegean region dropped sharply. The archaeological record shows a dramatic impoverishment of material culture across the entire region. What historians call the Greek Dark Ages, that long twilight between the fall of Mycenae and the emergence of the Greek city-states, was in part the long shadow cast by a drought that struck a century and a half before Homer was born. Water had unmade a world. It would do it again. In the tropical lowlands of what is now Mexico, Guatemala and Belize, the classic Maya built one of the most intellectually sophisticated civilizations in human history. They developed a writing system capable of recording anything that language could express: history, myth, poetry, dynastic propaganda, astronomical observation. Their calendar system was more accurate than the Julian calendar that Europe would use for 1,000 years after Maya astronomers had developed something better. They built cities of extraordinary ambition. Tikal in the Guatemalan jungle held perhaps 90,000 people at its peak. Calakmul in southern Mexico was its great rival, matching it temple for pyramid across centuries of intermittent warfare. Palenque, Copan, Caracol, Uxmal. The list of great Maya cities runs to dozens, each a distinct political entity, each with its own royal dynasty and patron gods and calendar priests. This was not one civilization in the sense of a unified empire. It was a constellation, a dense interconnected network of city-states, trading partners, and bitter rivals, bound together by shared religion, shared artistic traditions, shared astronomical knowledge, and the shared tropical landscape that fed them all. The Maya agricultural system that sustained these cities was, by any measure, a remarkable engineering achievement. In a landscape of thin tropical soils that threatened to wash away in the seasonal rains, Maya farmers constructed elaborate raised field systems in the wetlands, channeling water through networks of canals that both drained the fields in the wet season and irrigated them in the dry. Terraced hillsides held the soil in place. Household gardens packed with dozens of food plants supplemented the main crops of maize, beans, and squash. For centuries, roughly from 250 CE to the late 700s, this system worked. The cities grew. The dynasties accumulated power and wealth. The artists produced jade masks of heartbreaking beauty and carved stone portraits of such psychological precision that individual royal faces feel knowable across 1,000 years. Then, between approximately 800 and 1000 CE, roughly 60% of the southern Maya lowland population disappeared. The great cities were abandoned. The royal courts fell silent. The stone monuments stopped being carved. And in Maya archaeology, this is the clearest possible signal of collapse, because the erection of dated stelae was one of the primary ritual obligations of a living king. When the stelae stop, the king is gone. For most of the 20th century, the Maya collapse was explained primarily through the lens of warfare and political dysfunction. The Classic period was indeed characterized by intense rivalry between city-states, and there is solid archaeological evidence for escalating warfare in the final centuries of the Classic period. Some scholars pointed to the ecological pressures of overpopulation, too many people for the agricultural system to support, leading to deforestation, soil exhaustion, and declining yields. All of these factors were real, but they could not fully explain the sudden, comprehensive nature of the collapse, or its timing. What caused a civilization that had weathered political upheavals and population pressures for centuries to collapse within what, archaeologically speaking, is the blink of an eye? The answer came, as it had for the Akkadians and the Bronze Age peoples, from an unexpected quarter: the chemistry of ancient lake sediments. Lake Chichancanab in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula has become one of the most important paleoclimate archives in the Americas. Because the lake has no outlet, water only leaves it through evaporation, the chemical composition of its sediments is exquisitely sensitive to changes in the ratio of evaporation to rainfall. When rainfall decreases, evaporation concentrates certain chemical signatures in the sediment. When the climate is wet, those signatures dilute. Analysis published in 2018 by a team led by Nick Evans at the University of Cambridge revealed a startling finding: the century between 800 and 900 CE, the precise window of the Classic Maya collapse, saw drought conditions in the Yucatan more severe than anything in the previous 2,000 years of the lake's record. A series of prolonged droughts, interspersed with brief wet periods, but always returning to dry conditions, hammered the Maya agricultural system during precisely the period when the great southern cities were falling silent. The worst of these droughts, the research suggested, may have reduced annual rainfall by as much as 40 to 70% for periods of years. In a tropical system designed around reliable seasonal rain, a 40% reduction in rainfall was not just a hardship, it was an existential threat. The raised field systems that had made Maya agriculture so productive depended on a specific balance of water, enough to irrigate in the dry season, not so much that the fields flooded in the wet. Severe drought disrupted this balance in multiple ways. The canals that were supposed to provide dry season irrigation ran dry. The water management infrastructure that required constant collective maintenance, dredging, repair, construction, became harder to maintain as populations under food stress became less able to dedicate labour to communal projects. And there was a deeper problem, specific to the Maya lowlands: drinking water. The Yucatan Peninsula has almost no rivers. It is a vast limestone shelf through which rainwater drains into underground cave systems, the cenotes that the Maya used as sacred wells and principal water sources. In normal years, the cenotes were reliable. In drought years, the water table dropped, and the cenotes receded. For a city of tens of thousands of people without alternative water sources, a cenote that dropped below accessible levels was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. The political consequences of these material pressures cascaded through Maya society in ways that the historical and archaeological records allow us to trace with unusual precision. The later Classic period shows dramatic evidence of escalating elite competition and warfare. Cities that had been trading partners attacked each other. Dynastic legitimacy, always resting in Maya political theology on the king's ability to communicate with the gods and ensure agricultural abundance, became increasingly contested as the abundance failed. Kings who could not make it rain, literally in Maya religious cosmology, a royal obligation, lost legitimacy. Subjects who were hungry and afraid stopped building temples and started leaving. Elite competition intensified as the resource base contracted, turning the rivalry that had characterized the Classic period from a productive spur to artistic and architectural achievement into a destructive spiral of warfare and fragmentation. The drought didn't cause the warfare exactly, but it created the conditions under which warfare was inevitable, and under which warfare was no longer manageable. And the warfare in turn disrupted the agricultural system precisely when the agricultural system was already under maximum stress from the drought. The Classic Maya collapse was not one thing, it was a cascade. Drought triggering political instability triggering warfare, warfare disrupting agriculture, agricultural disruption causing famine, famine causing migration, migration causing the abandonment of cities, abandoned cities becoming indefensible against enemies, indefensibility causing further abandonment. Each step fed the next, and the drought was the first step. The Maya did not disappear. Their descendants live today across Mexico and Central America, speaking Maya languages, maintaining cultural traditions, and inhabiting the landscape their ancestors shaped. The collapse was not an ending but a transformation, a dramatic, painful, and massively destructive transformation, but one that human communities survived. But the great cities of the classic lowlands are gone. Tikal sleeps under the jungle canopy. Karakal's plazas are empty. Calakmul's pyramids rise from a forest so dense that aerial survey was the only way to map the full extent of the city. The jungle is patient. The drought was patient. And together, they were more powerful than any army. To understand what water meant to Angkor, you must understand the Tonle Sap. Every year, when the monsoon rains come to Southeast Asia, something extraordinary happens in the heart of Cambodia. The Mekong River, already one of the greatest waterways in Asia, already swollen with snowmelt from the Himalayas and rain from 1,000 upstream tributaries, fills beyond its banks and reverses the flow of one of its tributaries, the Tonle Sap River, pushing its water backward, inland, into a great lake. The lake swells from its dry season size of about 2,500 square kilometres to an area of up to 16,000 square kilometres, 6 times its original extent. The surrounding forest floods. Fish breed in extraordinary numbers in the flooded forest. When the monsoon ends and the Mekong drops, the water runs back out of the lake and the fish run with it, creating one of the most extraordinary inland fisheries in the world. The Khmer civilization built its greatest city next to this miracle. At its height, between the 9th and 15th centuries CE, Angkor was the largest pre-industrial city on Earth. The urban complex covered an area of roughly 1,000 square kilometres, larger than modern Los Angeles. Within it lived perhaps 750,000 people, sustained by one of the most sophisticated hydraulic engineering systems ever constructed. The Khmer kings built a network of massive reservoirs, the Baray, that captured the monsoon rains and stored them for dry season irrigation. The West Baray, still partially intact, is 8 kilometres long and 2 kilometres wide, holding enough water to sustain agriculture through the dry months. Hundreds of smaller reservoirs, canals, and water distribution channels integrated with this central system, routing water to rice paddies that produced multiple harvests per year when the monsoon cooperated. This hydraulic infrastructure was not merely agricultural, it was ideological. The berets were laid out in cosmological alignment with the temples and the cardinal directions. The king was not merely a ruler, he was the guarantor of the water, the mediator between heaven and the rice fields. Royal inscriptions boast of waterworks in the same breath as military victories. The city's identity was inseparable from the water that sustained it. For centuries the system worked magnificently. The monsoon came, the berets filled, the canals distributed, the rice paddies produced. Angkor's population grew to its extraordinary height. Angkor Wat itself, the largest religious structure ever built, a stone rendering of the Hindu cosmic mountain surrounded by a moat representing the cosmic ocean, was constructed in the 12th century at a moment of supreme Khmer confidence. The temple's walls are covered in intricate bas-reliefs, hundreds of meters of carved narrative depicting the Hindu epics, historical battles, celestial dances, scenes of daily life. It is one of the supreme artistic achievements of any civilization, created at a moment when a city powered by engineered water felt itself capable of anything. But the hydraulic system that had made Angkor great contained within it the seeds of its vulnerability. A system designed to capture and store monsoon water was exquisitely sensitive to what the monsoon did. When the rains arrived reliably and in normal quantities, the system functioned as designed. But when the monsoon varied, when it came late, or insufficient, or in great destructive floods that overwhelmed the infrastructure, the system's vulnerabilities became terrifyingly apparent. Tree ring records from ancient trees across mainland Southeast Asia have allowed climate scientists to reconstruct monsoon patterns across the region in unprecedented detail. The The picture that has emerged for the 14th and 15th centuries is one of extreme volatility. Megadroughts of exceptional severity alternating with catastrophic flood events, the entire region oscillating between the extremes of too little water and too much. The megadroughts struck the Angkor system at its most vulnerable points, the Berets. These enormous reservoirs required constant maintenance, regular dredging to prevent silting, continual repair of embankments and inlet channels, active management of water distribution. In years of normal monsoon, this maintenance was manageable. In years of drought, the barrays failed to fill, the rice paddies went unwatered, and the people who would have provided the maintenance labour were too hungry and too consumed with survival to perform it. A drought-stressed hydraulic system that went unrepaired became less capable of managing the next drought, and the drought after that. Each failure of maintenance made the system more vulnerable to the next climatic stress. The infrastructure that had made Angkor possible was consuming itself in a feedback loop driven by the changing monsoon. The floods, paradoxically, were almost as damaging as the droughts. When the monsoon arrived in excess, as tree ring records suggest it sometimes did in this period, the overcompensation after drought years, it overwhelmed channels and embankments designed for normal flow. Catastrophic floods could destroy in days what careful engineering had built over years, and the silt carried by floodwater, deposited in the barrays and channels, required enormous maintenance labour to clear, labour that a stressed and shrinking population had less and less capacity to provide. The Khmer kings responded to these pressures with increasing desperation. More temples were built, the cosmological water management symbolised in stone, amplified as the actual water management faltered. Inscriptions from the later Angkor period take on an increasingly beseeching quality, prayers rather than proclamations. Military conflict with the expanding Thai kingdoms to the north and west added political stress to the hydraulic crisis. A Thai sack of Angkor in 1431 is traditionally given as the date of the city's fall, and the military dimension was real, but the tree ring evidence suggests that Angkor's hydraulic infrastructure was already failing well before the Thai armies arrived. The city that fell in 1431 was not the city that had built Angkor Wat in the 12th century. It was a diminished, drought-stressed, flood-damaged, infrastructure-degraded remnant of that city, whose population had been declining for decades as the system that sustained it failed. The capital of the Khmer kingdom moved to the Mekong Delta, closer to the coast, where trading wealth could substitute for the hydraulic agriculture that the northern system could no longer reliably provide. Angkor was not so much destroyed as abandoned, left to the jungle as the people who had built it found less punishing places to live. Today, the roots of strangler figs embrace the temple towers of Taprom with what looks, from a certain angle, like tenderness. The forest has grown back across the plazas where a great civilization performed its ceremonies. The berets still hold some water, ghosts of the hydraulic system that once made this the largest pre-industrial city on Earth. The monsoon which built Angkor did not withdraw its favour. It simply became unpredictable in ways that the city's infrastructure could not absorb, and a city built on the precise calibration of water, dependent at every level of its existence on the monsoon's reliability, could not survive the monsoon's unreliability. What water gives, water can take back. The engineering achievement that made Angkor possible deserves to be understood in its full technical complexity, because the complexity itself explains the fragility. Modern hydrological surveys of the Angkor region, using airborne laser scanning technology called LiDAR that can penetrate the jungle canopy to reveal the terrain below, have revealed a water management system of staggering ambition. The Baray, the great reservoirs whose construction is celebrated in Khmer royal inscriptions, were not simply large holes filled with rainwater. They were engineered systems with inlet channels, overflow channels, and outlet systems designed to modulate the storage and release of water through the agricultural cycle with considerable precision. The West Baray, the largest, could hold approximately 50 million cubic meters of water. Its inlet channel connected it to the Siem Reap River through a series of weirs that could be adjusted to manage inflow. Its outlet at the southern end fed a distribution system that supplied irrigation channels across a wide area of the city's rice-growing hinterland. Managing this system was not a matter of simply opening and closing gates at the right moments. It required continuous observation of water levels across the entire network, coordination between teams managing different parts of the system, and the ability to make rapid adjustments in response to the unpredictable intensity of monsoon rainfall. Too little intake during the monsoon meant insufficient storage for the dry season. Too much meant the Beret's embankments could be overtopped, causing catastrophic failure. The Khmer kings maintained a specialized administrative corps dedicated exclusively to water management, the equivalent of a modern hydraulic engineering department, but operating with pre-industrial tools and organizational structures. Their knowledge was not written in technical manuals that have survived, it was embodied in practice, passed from experienced practitioners to apprentices, accumulated over generations of operational experience. This embodied knowledge was itself a vulnerability. When droughts stressed the system and the agricultural surplus that funded the water management administration shrank, the administrators who held this knowledge were among the first casualties of resource contraction. The expertise that had been built up over generations was not stored in texts or diagrams. It lived in people, and people who are not fed cannot work. The LiDAR surveys have revealed something else that the dense jungle had hidden for centuries: evidence of repeated, desperate modifications to the hydraulic system in what appear to be the system's final operational generations. The clean, geometrically precise engineering of the system's classical period gave way in its later phases to cruder interventions, channels dug at odd angles to connect depleted sections of the network to whatever water remained, embankments reinforced with materials suggesting emergency repair rather than planned maintenance, the progressive abandonment of peripheral parts of the network as the water supply shrank, the system condensing inward toward its core as resources contracted. This is the archaeology of a civilization fighting for its hydraulic life, not giving up, not collapsing passively, making intelligent, determined, increasingly desperate attempts to keep the water flowing. Smaller areas served more reliably, rather than larger areas served inadequately, concentration of remaining water resources toward the agricultural zones most critical to the city's survival. These modifications kept Angkor functioning for longer than it might otherwise have survived, but they could not substitute for what the modified monsoon was failing to deliver, the water itself. When the system finally failed, when the combination of drought, maintenance degradation, and catastrophic flood events broke the hydraulic network beyond what emergency modification could repair, the city it had sustained could not continue. A city of perhaps 750,000 people cannot feed itself from the surrounding unirrigated jungle. It feeds itself from paddy fields, and paddy fields without managed water are just mud. The hydraulic system was not infrastructure in the sense that a road is infrastructure, something useful but not absolutely necessary for basic survival. It was for Angkor the precondition of survival itself. When the water management failed, the people left, not all at once, not in panic. The abandonment of Angkor's urban core appears to have been a gradual process over decades, the population dispersing to places where water, from rivers, from unmanaged natural sources, was available without the maintenance burden of the great hydraulic network. The Khmer kingdom continued in diminished form from a new capital at Phnom Penh, where the confluence of the Mekong and the Tonle Sap River provided reliable water without the need for the elaborate engineering that Angkor had required. The old capital was not forgotten. It was simply no longer possible to sustain. The greatest city on earth had been a machine for converting monsoon water into urban civilization. When the monsoon became unreliable, the machine stopped working. The Chaco roads were built to bring pilgrims and trade goods into the canyon. In the drought years of the 12th century, they became the routes of departure. The dispersal of the Chaco population is one of the most interesting migration stories in North American archaeology. Interesting not because it is dramatic, but because it is so clearly organized. This was not a panicked flight. The archaeological evidence suggests deliberate, planned movement to specific locations that had been chosen for specific reasons. Some communities moved to spring-fed locations along canyon walls where reliable water was available independent of rainfall. Some moved eastward toward the Rio Grande watershed, where perennial rivers could support agriculture without dependence on rainfall patterns. Some established new communities in mountain areas where precipitation was more reliable than on the open plateau. Some appear to have merged with existing communities in better watered regions, bringing Chang'an ceremonial knowledge and architectural traditions with them as cultural currency. What they carried with them was not just material culture, pottery styles, architectural knowledge, turquoise jewellery from the Chacoan trade networks. They carried knowledge of the ceremonial system that had organised Chacoan society, knowledge of the astronomical observations that had given Chaco its calendar precision, knowledge of the agricultural techniques that had made farming possible in a semi-arid landscape. This is important. The collapse of Chaco Canyon as a physical place did not mean the destruction of Chacoan civilization as a cultural tradition. The tradition persisted and transformed in the communities the Chacoan diaspora created. Archaeologists can trace specific pottery designs, specific architectural features, specific ceremonial practices migrating outward from Chaco into the communities that absorbed its former population. The people adapted. They took what was most valuable about their civilization, not the stones of the great houses which were left behind, but the knowledge and the practices and the social relationship, and they moved. And then the great drought of 1276 to 1299 struck the communities they had moved to. Visual, a dramatic wide shot of the Mesa Verde cliff dwellings, the extraordinary architectural achievement of the late 13th century, buildings tucked into cliff alcoves that seemed to defy possibility. Built with the knowledge and skills of the Chacoan tradition, in a location chosen partly for its defensive advantages and partly for its access to springs. Then the same scene showing the buildings empty, the people gone, the construction and the abandonment separated by less than a generation. 16.9 widescreen. SFX. First, the sounds of the cliff dwellings occupied, voices echoing in the alcoves, children playing in the protected courtyards, the sounds of a community that has found relative safety and rebuilt. Then later, the silence of abandonment, wind in the empty alcoves, nothing else. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde represent in some ways the last flowering of the ancestral Puebloan architectural tradition in the Four Corners region. They were built in the decade or two before the Great Drought struck, at a moment when communities driven from the more exposed plateau locations were consolidating in defensible, spring-accessible canyon alcoves. They were extraordinary buildings. The multi-story architecture tucked into the cliff faces required engineering skill and organizational capacity that had not diminished with the Chacoan collapse. The communities that built Cliff Palace and Balcony House and Spruce Tree House were not reduced people doing reduced work. They were skilled people, drawing on a century and a half of accumulated Chacoan architectural tradition, doing remarkable work. And they were there for perhaps 20 or 30 years before the Great Drought made them untenable too. The abandonment of the cliff dwellings was complete and final. No population returned to the Four Corners region in anything like pre-drought numbers. The drainage of population toward the Rio Grande Valley was permanent. The landscape that had supported tens of thousands of people under the most sophisticated agricultural management in pre-Columbian North America outside of Mexico reverted to a lower density occupation by communities with less intensive agricultural systems less productive, but also less vulnerable to the specific climate stresses that had destroyed the Chacoan world. The people who left became the ancestors of the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona. The culture they brought with them, the ceremony, the architecture, the social organization, the agricultural knowledge, was transformed by the journey and by the new landscape, but was not extinguished. What was extinguished was the particular expression of that culture in the Four Corners landscape. The stones of Pueblo Bonito sit in their canyon today under a brilliant high desert sky, slowly eroding, slowly returning to the earth from which they were quarried 8 centuries ago. They receive millions of visitors each year now, people who stand in the Great Kiva's circular space and try to imagine the community that gathered there, the ceremonies that were performed, the administrative decisions that were made. The visitors are quiet in that space, most of them. There is something about a place of such evident intention and such evident abandonment that induces quietness. The canyon does not explain itself. The stones do not justify their emptiness. They only endure the way stone endures, which is to say, long after the reasons for their abandonment have themselves been forgotten. Visual. A close-up of Pueblo Bonito's Great Kiva. The circular chamber, the roof supports, the ceremonial features still visible in the adobe walls. A modern visitor standing at the edge, small against the scale of the space, looking inward. The silence of the space palpable. Cinematic oil painting, the light coming from the Kiva's open sky above. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the silence of the Great Kiva, the particular acoustic quality of a large circular chamber open to the sky, the way sounds in it are absorbed by the adobe walls and the open air above. Wind, the distant call of a raven, nothing else. Expansion, when the monsoon abandons its children. The Tang Dynasty's impossible choice. Visual, a dramatic wide shot of the Wei River Valley near Chang'an. The river valley at the heart of the Tang agricultural system, the terraced hillsides above it showing the ambitious extent of the cultivation that fed the empire. In normal years, the valley floor green with crops and the river running reliably. In the drought years, the valley floor pale and thin, the river low in its banks, the terraced hillsides showing the beginning of erosion where the drought-weakened vegetation can no longer hold the soil. Cinematic oil painting, 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the sounds of an agricultural valley in two states. First, in normal years, water in irrigation channels, workers in fields, the productive noise of a working agricultural landscape. Then, in drought, the dry sound of wind over thin crops, the silence where water should be, the absence of the usual field sounds. The Tang Dynasty's response to the droughts of the 9th century reveals, with unusual clarity, the impossible administrative arithmetic that drought imposes on centralized agricultural states. The Tang tax system was one of the most sophisticated in the pre-modern world. It was designed to be fair, to extract a fixed proportion of agricultural production rather than a fixed absolute amount, so that in poor years the state would take proportionally less. In theory, this should have made the system resilient to climate variability. When crops failed, taxes fell with them. In practice, the system failed in a way that its designers had not anticipated. The state's obligations did not fall when the crop yields fell. The Tang military establishment, the armies of the border, the armies of the imperial capital, the armies of the regional garrisons, required provisioning at roughly constant levels regardless of what the harvest did. An army that is paid half rations because the harvest was poor is not a half-effective army. It is an army that is close to mutiny. The Tang administrative apparatus, the examinations, the regional governments, the imperial court, required salaries and operational funding at levels that the court was politically unable to reduce, because the people who would have been reduced were the people with the power to resist reduction. Visual, a Tang Dynasty administrative scene, the court at Chang'an in session, the elaborate hierarchy of officials in their ranked robes, the emperor at the centre. The scene of a functioning state machine that appears to have not yet registered what is happening to its agricultural base, the machinery of government running on depleted fuel, cinematic oil painting, 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the formal sounds of a Tang imperial court, ritual music, the announcement of officials' ranks, the formal speech patterns of court address, the sounds of a state performing its own functioning, even as the material basis of that functioning erodes. And so what happened was what always happens when a state's costs are fixed but its revenues are variable. The state tried to maintain its revenues by increasing the rate of extraction from a shrinking base. In practice, this meant that farmers in drought-affected regions, already struggling to produce enough to feed themselves, faced tax demands calculated not on what the drought had allowed them to grow, but on what the state needed to function. Tax collectors in the drought years of the 9th century were not conducting empirical assessments of actual yields and adjusting demands accordingly. They were meeting quotas set by an administrative system in Chang'an that was partially insulated from the reality of the fields. The gap between what farmers had and what the state demanded was bridged in the short term by debt. Farmers borrowed from money lenders, often connected to powerful local families or Buddhist monasteries, to pay their taxes. The debt accumulated. The drought continued. The next year's harvest was not better. The tax demand was not reduced. The debt deepened. Over a generation of drought, a farming class that had been reasonably prosperous in the Tang's good years became a farming class of indebted, food-insecure, deeply resentful people who had been forced to surrender the reserves that were their only buffer against future bad years in order to meet tax demands from a state that could not or would not acknowledge that those reserves no longer existed. Visual, a Chinese farming family in the drought years, the thinness of the harvest visible in their granary, the tax collector's receipt on the table, the debt tally marks on the wall, the arithmetic of their situation legible in the composition, what came in, What went out, what is left, which is not enough. Cinematic oil painting in the intimate scale of a household scene. 16:9 widescreen. SFX. The quiet sounds of a family in economic distress, the careful measuring of grain that is not enough, the sound of a debt being recorded, the silence of a household that has run out of options. No dramatic sounds, just the small, specific sounds of ordinary people in impossible situations. This is the social fuel from which Huang Chao built his rebellion. He did not need to persuade hungry farmers that they were hungry. They knew. He did not need to convince them that the Tang state was extracting more than it was providing. They had the tally marks on their walls. What he provided was something more valuable than information, a direction, a target, a narrative that said the suffering had a cause, an exploitative state, a corrupt elite, a system that had stopped working for the people it claimed to govern, and a proposed remedy. The remedy was, functionally, the destruction of that state and that elite. The Huang Chao Rebellion was one of the most destructive events in Chinese history. The rebel forces that swept through the Yellow River Basin between 875 and 884 CE killed in numbers that contemporary sources describe with a kind of numbed horror. Their figures almost certainly inflated by the trauma of the witnesses, but the underlying reality of mass death unquestionable. Cities burned, populations fled, the dense, productive agricultural landscape of the northern Chinese heartland, already weakened by drought, was further damaged by the military destruction that the rebellion brought to it. Chang'an, sacked by Huang Chao's forces in 881, never fully recovered. The magnificent cosmopolitan capital of the Tang's golden age, the city that had held 1 million people from every corner of the known world, was a diminished and damaged city when the dynasty finally fell in 907. The drought had not killed the Tang Dynasty directly. It had created the conditions under which the dynasty's own population destroyed it. This is the terrible efficiency of drought as a political force. It does not need to kill civilizations itself. It only needs to make their own people willing to do it. Visual. Chang'an after the sack. The great avenues emptied. The markets burned. The palace district damaged. The remaining population moving through a diminished version of what had been the greatest city in the world. Not rubble exactly, but absence. The absence of the population, the commerce, the confidence that had made the city what it was. Cinematic oil painting, the scale of loss visible in the quality of the emptiness. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the sounds of a diminished city, reduced foot traffic on the wide avenues, the echo of fewer voices in a space designed for many more, wind moving through areas of the city that are no longer maintained, the acoustic signature of a city that has lost a large portion of itself. Chapter 5. The Great Silence of Chaco. The ancestral Puebloan abandonment, 1100–1300 CE. Visual. A sweeping wide-angle shot of Chaco Canyon at dawn. The red and orange sandstone walls catching the first light. The ruins of Pueblo Bonito emerging from shadow in the canyon floor below. The sky above vast and cloudless, and already beginning to bleach with heat. Cinematic oil painting with the stark, beautiful palette of the American Southwest. 16.9 widescreen. SFX. The absolute silence of a desert canyon at dawn, the kind of silence so complete it has texture. Then, slowly, the first bird calling in the canyon walls. Wind, barely audible, moving through ancient stone rooms. In the high desert of what is now northwestern New Mexico, in a shallow canyon cut by an intermittent river into the ochre sandstone of the Colorado Plateau, the ancestral Puebloan people built something extraordinary. Chaco Canyon was, between roughly 850 and 1150 CE, the center of a regional system that covered an area the size of Ireland. The great houses, Pueblo Bonito, Chetroquetl, Pueblo del Arroyo, were among the largest buildings in pre-Columbian North America. Pueblo Bonito alone had over 600 rooms and rose 4 stories. The buildings were oriented with precise astronomical alignment, their rooms arranged to capture the solstice sun through windows and doorways, in ways that required sustained observation and sophisticated planning. Roads, remarkably straight, engineered roads, some more than 30 feet wide, ran outward from Chaco in cardinal directions for hundreds of miles, connecting the canyon to dozens of outlier communities across the region. Turquoise from distant mines arrived at Chaco in extraordinary quantities. Macaws, bright red parrots kept alive in the canyon's inhospitable climate through deliberate cultivation, spoke in the plazas of great houses. Cylinder jars containing cacao residue, chocolate from plants that grew far to the south, have been found in Chaco's archaeological deposits. Visual, a dramatic reconstruction of Pueblo Bonito at its height. The great D-shaped structure complete and inhabited, its 4 stories catching afternoon sun, the great kivas sunken in the plazas, the canyon walls rising on both sides. The extraordinary scale and architectural precision rendered in detailed cinematic oil painting, 16.9 widescreen, SFX, the ambient sounds of Chaco Canyon at its height, the distant sound of construction, drums echoing from a great kiva, the movement of people in the plazas, the surprising presence of macaw calls in the high desert air. This was a place of ceremony, pilgrimage, and redistribution. The roads that connected it to the wider regional network were not primarily for transport in the modern sense. They were for movement of people to and from the centre, for the flow of ritual goods and agricultural surplus that sustained the Chacan system's social hierarchy. And at its heart, the entire system depended on an agricultural base in an environment that was, by any reasonable standard, barely suitable for agriculture at all. The Colorado Plateau is semi-arid. The soils are thin. The frost-free growing season is short. Rainfall is unpredictable, highly variable from year to year, and concentrated in summer monsoons that can be intense in one part of the canyon and absent in another, separated by only a few miles. Farming in Chaco Canyon was not easy. It was possible, in good years, but it required every trick and technology the ancestral Puebloans had developed. Check dams to control water flow, grid gardens to capture and concentrate rainfall, careful selection of varieties adapted to the local conditions. In good years, the system produced enough surplus to sustain not just the farming communities, but the specialized ritual and administrative functions of the great houses. In bad years, the surplus disappeared, and everything that depended on it was at risk. Visual, a close-up of the desert soil in Chaco Canyon, thin, sandy, scattered with small stones, a hand reaching into the frame, pressing the earth, releasing it, showing its dryness. Behind this, the monumental ruins of Pueblo Bonito visible in the background, the contrast between the poverty of the agricultural base and the ambition of the architecture viscerally apparent. 16:9 wide screen. SFX. The dry whisper of sand moving across stone, wind through ruined rooms, the particular silence of a place that was once busy and is no longer. Tree ring records from the Chaco region are among the most detailed paleoclimate archives in the American Southwest, thanks to the extraordinary preservation conditions of the high desert and the long tradition of dendrochronology, tree ring dating, that began in the Southwest in the early 20th century. What those tree rings show is a complex story of boom and bust, climate and response, resilience and ultimate failure. The height of the Chacan system, the great building boom of the 11th and early 12th centuries, coincided with a period of relatively reliable rainfall. The monsoons came when they were supposed to. The fields produced, the system expanded. Then, around 1130 CE, a 50-year drought struck. Visual, a graphic representation of the tree ring record, narrow rings of drought years stretching across 5 decades, the drought's duration and severity visible in the thinness of each ring. The scientific visualization embedded in a warm historical context. 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the sound of a tree being cross-sectioned, a saw working through wood slowly. Then the quiet that follows. The rings tell their story in silence. 50 years is not a temporary downturn. It is not a bad decade that can be weathered by drawing down stored reserves. It is a sustained multi-generational climate shift that exhausts surpluses, depletes stored food, forces communities into competition for whatever resources remain, and eventually makes continued occupation of marginal agricultural land simply impossible. By 1150 CE, Chaco Canyon was in full decline. The great houses were being abandoned. The pilgrimage roads brought fewer people. The elaborate redistribution system that had moved goods across hundreds of miles was collapsing as the agricultural base it depended on contracted. People moved. The Chacoan population dispersed across the region, some heading north and east into areas with more reliable water, some joining other communities, some establishing new settlements that tried to replicate aspects of the Chacoan ritual system without the material base that had sustained it. Visual, a wide shot of Chaco Canyon in the grip of drought, the canyon floor cracked and bare, the sandstone walls baking in the midday sun, the ruins of Pueblo Bonito half in shadow. A single figure visible in the distant ruins, too small to identify, moving through the abandoned rooms. Cinematic oil painting, the heat visible in the quality of the light. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the intense heat sounds of a desert canyon at noon, the buzz of insects, the creak of sun-heated rock, the eerie silence of the canyon walls absorbing and radiating warmth. No human sounds at all. The story did not end there. The Chacoan diaspora seeded new communities, and the ancestral Puebloan tradition continued and transformed. By the late 13th century, another drought, the Great Drought of 1276 to 1299 CE, one of the most severe in the entire tree ring record, struck the entire Colorado Plateau region. Communities that had re-established themselves after the Chaco collapse now faced a second, devastating climatic blow. This time, the response was a massive population movement southward and eastward, toward the Rio Grande Valley and other river systems that offered more reliable water. The Four Corners region, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, had been home to tens of thousands of people. Within a generation of the Great Drought's end, it was largely empty. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, built in the 13th century in a final flowering of ancestral Puebloan architectural creativity, were abandoned within a few decades of their construction. They survive today because they were so completely abandoned that no subsequent population disturbed them, left intact in their canyon alcoves, their walls still standing, their rooms still containing the tools and vessels of the people who simply walked away. Visual, a dramatic shot of a cliff dwelling at Mesa Verde. The multi-story buildings tucked into a sandstone alcove high above the canyon floor, perfectly preserved, the rooms intact, the walls still standing after 7 centuries of abandonment. The scene is extraordinary in its completeness, a moment frozen. Cinematic oil painting, the warm sandstone colours glowing in afternoon sun. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the silence of the cliff dwellings, an extraordinary, almost physical silence, disturbed only by wind moving across the canyon opening, the distant call of a hawk. The rooms echo the sound of nothing. The Pueblo peoples did not disappear. They are the ancestors of the modern Pueblo communities of New Mexico and Arizona, Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and the Rio Grande Pueblos, whose cultures carry forward, transformed but unbroken, traditions that stretch back to the people who built Pueblo Bonito and carved the roads of Chaco. But the landscape they inhabited was changed irrevocably by the droughts of the 12th and 13th centuries. The Colorado Plateau, once home to a dense regional civilization centered on Chaco Canyon, has never again supported a comparable population density. The thin soils that the ancestral Puebloans had farmed so carefully did not recover quickly. In some places, the erosion triggered by drought and agricultural abandonment opened arroyos, deep gullies cutting through the land, that made refarming impossible even when the rains returned. The drought had not just removed people from the landscape, it had changed the landscape itself. Visual, a final wide shot of Chaco Canyon at dusk, the canyon walls turning deep red and purple in the failing light, Pueblo Bonito a dark mass below, a wedge of stars becoming visible in the sky above the canyon rim. The beauty of the scene absolute and indifferent to the human story it witnessed. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the nighttime sounds of the canyon. Insects, a distant coyote, the settling of ancient stone. The stars visible above the canyon rim suggest the same sky the ancestral Puebloans read for their astronomical alignments. The canyon does not mourn, it simply endures. Chapter 6. The Yellow River runs dry. Drought and the fall of the Tang Dynasty. 850-907 CE. Visual. A sweeping panoramic view of the Tang Dynasty capital, Chang'an, at its peak. The vast rectangular grid of streets, the imperial palace complex dominating the northern sector, the markets filled with merchants from every corner of Asia, Buddhist pagodas rising above the roofline, the most cosmopolitan city on earth in its time, rendered in luminous cinematic oil painting. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the ambient sounds of Tang Dynasty Chang'an, a cosmopolitan city hum, the sound of Central Asian music from a market stall, the distant chanting of Buddhist monks, the rattle of cartwheels on paved streets, multiple languages audible simultaneously. At its height, the Tang Dynasty's capital of Chang'an was the most cosmopolitan city in the world. By the 8th century CE, the city held perhaps 1 million people within its walls, merchants from Persia, Central Asia, Korea, Japan and India, Nestorian Christian priests and Zoroastrian fire worshippers practicing their faiths beside Buddhist monasteries and Confucian temples, poets composing verse in regulated forms of extraordinary formal complexity, painters capturing the fluid grace of Tang court women and the wild gallop of Central Asian horses. The Tang state that sustained this capital was an administrative and military achievement of the first order. Its equal field land allocation system distributed agricultural land with a regularity that earlier dynasties had only dreamed of. Its examination system was beginning the long process of making merit, rather than birth, the primary qualification for government service. Its military reach extended across Central Asia to the borders of Persia, and Tang diplomatic correspondence circulated across a network that encompassed most of the known world. China under the Tang was not merely the world's most populous state, it was arguably its most sophisticated. Visual, a close-up of Tang Dynasty artistic production, a painted scroll showing a court scene, exquisitely rendered horses and figures in the distinctive elegant style of the period. The camera moves slowly across the surface of the painting, reading it as a document of a lost world. Archival documentary aesthetic, warm amber light. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the sound of a brush moving on silk, the particular whisper of fine painting, and the quiet concentration of an artist at work. Distant music, refined and courtly. But the Tang dynasty's prosperity, like every great agrarian empire of the pre-modern world, rested on the agricultural system of the Yellow River Basin. The millions of peasant farmers who fed the capital, provisioned the armies, and generated the tax revenues that paid for everything worked, land that depended on reliable monsoon rains, and on the complex irrigation systems that the Yellow River and its tributaries made possible. The Yellow River, called China's sorrow by later generations, for the catastrophic floods it periodically unleashed, was also China's greatest agricultural asset. Its sediment-rich floodplain produced among the most fertile agricultural land in Asia. When the monsoon cooperated and the river flowed reliably, the northern Chinese agricultural system could support population densities that astonished later European observers. When the monsoon failed, everything else followed. Visual, a dramatic wide shot of the Yellow River, the ochre-brown water moving through a landscape of Lewis hills, the colour of the water exactly matching the soil it carries, the river and the land almost indistinguishable. Cinematic oil painting, the vastness of the northern Chinese landscape palpable. 16:9 widescreen. SFX. The sound of the Yellow River, not a clear mountain stream but a heavy sediment-laden flow, the sound of water carrying enormous amounts of material, a kind of thick, purposeful, moving sound. Tree ring records and historical climate reconstructions for 9th century China have revealed a pattern of intensifying drought that struck the Yellow River Basin during precisely the period of Tang Dynasty decline. The monsoon, which normally reached deep into northern China carrying the moisture that fed the crucial summer crops, became weaker and less reliable from the mid-9th century onward. The agricultural consequences were severe. In good years, the Tang tax system extracted roughly 1/3 of agricultural production for the state. In drought years, that production fell, and yet the state's obligations did not fall with it. Armies still needed provisioning, officials still needed salaries, the capital still needed feeding. The gap between what the agricultural system could produce in drought years and what the state needed to function was bridged, year after year, in ways that became increasingly destructive. Higher tax rates on a shrinking harvest, forced requisitioning of grain that left farming communities without adequate seed for the next planting, the forced conversion of peasants into state labourers, pulling hands from fields during crucial agricultural periods. Visual, a cinematic wide shot of northern Chinese farmland under drought conditions, the loess fields cracked and pale, the millet crops stunted and yellowing, an irrigation channel barely flowing, peasant farmers visible in the distance, their movements slow with exhaustion and hunger, oil painting in muted, dry colours. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the sounds of drought-stressed agricultural work, the scrape of hose on dry earth, the laboured breathing of hungry people working too hard, a child crying in the distance, wind-carrying dust. The Huangchao Rebellion, which erupted in 874 CE and eventually sacked Chang'an itself in 881, is generally treated as the event that broke the Tang Dynasty's back, and the rebellion was real, catastrophic, and decisive. The rebel forces who swept through the Yellow River Basin, sacking cities and massacring populations, destroyed the administrative and economic infrastructure that the Tang state needed to function. But the rebellion did not emerge from a prosperous countryside. It emerged from a countryside that had been subjected to years of drought-intensified taxation, food insecurity, and imperial requisitioning. The rebel forces were not abstract malcontents. They were hungry people from drought-stressed communities who had concluded that the Tang state was extracting from them the last food they needed to survive. Huang Chao himself, a salt merchant who had failed the imperial examinations and nursed his grievances into a revolutionary program, was able to recruit an army of hundreds of thousands because hundreds of thousands of people had nothing left to lose. The drought had not created Huang Chao, but it had created the conditions in which Huang Chao's message resonated with desperate force. Visual, a dramatic shot of the road leading into Chang'an, once the most magnificent avenue in the world, now crowded with desperate people moving in both directions, refugees from the rebellion, and drought mixing with fleeing officials. The imperial capital visible in the background, smoke rising from multiple quarters, cinematic oil painting, the chaos and scale of collapse, 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the sounds of a city in crisis. Distant shouting, the roar of fire, the movement of large crowds on unpaved roads, a distant military drum, the wailing of someone who has lost something, or someone. The Tang Dynasty survived the Huangchao Rebellion in name only. What emerged from the fires of Chang'an was a shell, a dynasty that still had an emperor and a court, but had lost effective control of most of China to regional warlords, the Jidushi, who had originally been appointed as military governors to defend the empire, and now found themselves running independent states. When the last Tang emperor was deposed in 907, ending the dynasty, it was less a coup than a formality. Power had long since fragmented beyond recovery. The period that followed, the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, was 50 years of political fragmentation, military conflict, and continuing climatic stress. Only when the Song dynasty emerged in 960 did China begin to reunify, and the Song China that resulted was, in important ways, a different civilization from Tang China, more mercantile, less agrarian, more focused on the south, where the climate was more reliable, than on the Yellow River heartland. The drought had not just ended a dynasty. It had pushed the centre of Chinese civilization southward, toward the Yangtze River basin and the rice paddies of the south, where the monsoon was more reliable. It had made the Yellow River basin, China's sorrow, less central to Chinese civilization than it had been since civilization began there millennia before. Visual, a wide aerial shot of the Yellow River basin at dusk, the river visible in the distance, winding through a landscape that looks emptied of the dense agricultural activity it once supported. The silence of the landscape after catastrophe. Cinematic oil painting, the colours muted and elegiac. 16.9 widescreen. SFX. The sound of the Yellow River at low water, a diminished flow, the sound of water moving slowly through a channel that was once fuller, wind over a landscape that has seen too much. What the Tang Dynasty's fall tells us is something important about the relationship between climate stress and political systems. The drought did not have to destroy China's agricultural base directly to cause the dynasty's collapse. It only had to create enough stress, in enough places, over enough time, to delegitimize the state in the eyes of the people the state depended on. A dynasty that cannot feed its people loses the mandate of heaven, the divine authorization to rule that Chinese political theory understood as the ultimate source of royal legitimacy. This was not merely a metaphor, it was a practical statement about power, a state that extracts but does not provide, that taxes but cannot protect, that demands loyalty from people it cannot feed, is a state whose days are numbered. The drought proved the Tang's mandate had lapsed. The river did not need to stop flowing for the dynasty to fall, it only needed to flow less certainly than the state required. Visual, a final image, a single Tang Dynasty bronze lamp, its flame still burning in a darkened room. Around it, the shadows of emptiness, of a palace abandoned. The lamp illuminating nothing but the fact of its own persistence. Cinematic chiaroscuro, 16:9 widescreen. SFX, a single lamp flame, the faint sound of a wick burning. Outside, far away, the sound of wind, then silence so complete it has weight. Chapter 7. The River That Disappeared, the Indus Valley Civilization and the Sarasvati, 2600–1300 BCE. Visual, an aerial reconstruction of Mohenjo-Daro at its height. The planned grid of streets, the brick-lined drainage channels, the great bath gleaming in morning sun, the citadel mound rising above the lower city. The sophistication of the urban planning visible from above, a city designed with a precision that would not be matched in South Asia for millennia. Cinematic oil painting, warm morning light, 16.9 widescreen. SFX. The ambient sounds of a great Bronze Age city, the rhythm of a potter's wheel, water flowing through drainage channels, voices calling across rooftops, the distant sound of a musician playing a simple stringed instrument in an inner courtyard. Of all the ancient civilizations destroyed by drought and climate change, the Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization, may be the most mysterious. At its height between roughly 2600 and 1900 BCE, it was the largest of the world's first urban civilizations, covering an area greater than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Its cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa the largest, but more than 1,000 sites identified across the region, were remarkable for their urban planning. The streets ran in precise grids. Every house had access to covered drainage. A sophisticated public water system with wells placed at regular intervals served the population. The Indus people traded with Mesopotamia. They produced standardized weights and measures, suggesting sophisticated commerce. They developed a writing system, the Indus script, that has never been deciphered, leaving us unable to read their thoughts in their own words. And they built on a floodplain that was, for a time, extraordinarily productive. Visual, a close-up of Indus Valley artifacts arranged on a surface. The tiny precision figurines, the standardized weights, the stamp seals with their undeciphered script, the evidence of a sophisticated and organized civilization. Each object extraordinary for its age and quality. Archival museum display aesthetic in warm amber light, 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the quiet of a museum, footsteps on stone floors, the hush of preserved objects that have survived millennia. A single seal being examined, turned in a researcher's hand. The agricultural system of the Indus Valley was fed by an extraordinary complex of rivers. The Indus itself, with its seasonal floods bringing Himalayan meltwater and sediment to the floodplain, and the Gagga-Hakra river system, which ran parallel to the Indus in what is now the India-Pakistan border region. The Gagga-Hakra is crucial to understanding what happened to the Indus civilization, and it is one of the most debated rivers in the history of scholarship. In ancient Hindu texts, this region was home to a great river called the Sarasvati, described in the Rig Veda as mighty, surpassing all other rivers, a river of sacred significance and extraordinary breadth. Today, the Gagga-Hakra is a seasonal, intermittent stream, flowing only in the monsoon, disappearing into the desert sands of the Thar in the dry season. But the ancient drainage channels and the distribution of Indus sites along its former course suggest that at some point in the past it carried far more water. Visual, a dramatic landscape shot of the Thar Desert in Rajasthan. The ancient dry channel of the Gagga-Hakra visible as a slight depression in the landscape, discernible only because the vegetation along it is marginally different from the surrounding desert. The evidence of a great river in a now empty landscape, cinematic oil painting, the subtlety of the visual evidence requiring the eye to seek it out. 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the sound of the Thar Desert, wind over sand dunes, the dry whisper of desert vegetation, the absence of water anywhere in the soundscape, the silence where a great river once ran. What happened to the Gyaga Hakra, to the Sarasvati, is a story of long-term geological and climatic change operating on timescales that dwarf any individual civilization, but whose consequences were felt acutely by the people who lived through the transition. In the 3rd millennium BCE, the river was fed by glacial meltwater from the Himalayas, running year-round in sufficient volume to sustain dense agricultural settlement along its banks. Hundreds of Indus sites clustered along its course, including some of the largest urban centres in the civilization. But beginning around 2000 BCE, a drying trend in the South Asian monsoon, part of the same global climate shift that was affecting the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia at roughly the same time, began reducing the river's flow. The glaciers that fed it were retreating. The monsoon rains that supplemented the glacial meltwater were becoming less reliable. The Gyaga Hakra was weakening. Visual, a reconstruction sequence showing the Gyaga Hakra River's decline. First, at its full flow, a broad river supporting agriculture and settlement, then progressively drying, the settled zone shrinking, the desert advancing from the south and east. A time-lapse of centuries rendered in cinematic oil painting. 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the sound of a river gradually diminishing, from the full rushing sound of a major watercourse to the smaller sound of a seasonal stream to the whisper of water in a drying channel to silence. As the river weakened, the Indus civilization began a long, complex process of transformation and decline. Unlike the Akkadian collapse, which was relatively rapid, the Harappan decline was drawn out over centuries, which makes it harder to see as a single event, but no less devastating in its cumulative effect. The large cities were gradually abandoned, not in a single exodus, but in a slow deflation, population by population, decade by decade. The standardized weights and measures disappeared, suggesting the breakdown of the long-distance trade networks that had required them. The drainage systems fell into disrepair. The writing system, whatever it encoded, stopped being used. The urban planning that had distinguished Harappan cities from every other Bronze Age civilization gradually gave way to less formally organized settlement. People moved east and southeast, toward the Ganges-Yamuna watershed, where the monsoon was more reliable and perennial rivers could sustain agriculture. The population of the Indus heartland declined dramatically. Visual, a wide shot of Mohenjo-Daro's ruins as they exist today. The brick walls still standing to considerable height, the street grid still legible, the Great Bath still identifiable, but everything silent and empty under a fierce South Asian sun. The quality of the ruins suggesting not violent destruction, but gradual abandonment. 16:9 widescreen. SFX. The profound silence of Mohenjo-Daro today, wind across brick, the distant cry of a bird, the heat pressing down on the ancient city, the sounds of absence. The decipherment of the Indus script, if it ever comes, might tell us directly what the Harappan people thought was happening to them. Whether they blamed the gods or their leaders, or simply accepted the changing landscape and moved on, we cannot say. What the settlement patterns tell us is this: they were sophisticated observers of their environment, and when the environment changed, they responded pragmatically rather than stubbornly. They did not, as far as we can tell, die in their cities because they refused to leave. They left. They found new places. The cultural traditions that archaeologists can trace, certain ceramic styles, certain artistic conventions, certain architectural preferences, persisted and transformed in the new regions the Harappan diaspora settled. The civilization did not end. It transformed, losing its urban complexity, its long-distance trade networks, its writing system, but persisting as a cultural and demographic presence that would eventually contribute to the formation of later South Asian civilizations. But the great cities, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, were abandoned, and the river that had made them possible became the seasonal ghost of the Gyaga Hakra, flowing only in the monsoon, vanishing in the dry season, barely recognizable as the Sarasvati that ancient texts had described as surpassing all other rivers. Visual, a sunset over the ancient Indus floodplain, a landscape of extraordinary flatness stretching to the horizon, the light turning the dust and the ancient alluvial soil to gold. A single excavation trench visible in the foreground, the layered history of the site exposed in its walls, cinematic oil painting, the scale of the landscape dwarfing the evidence of human occupation. 16:9 widescreen. SFX. The wind of the Sindh plain at evening. Warm, dry, carrying dust, the sound of a landscape that has absorbed the weight of 5,000 years and gives nothing back. In the distance, a muezzin's call, a contemporary sound anchoring the eternal landscape. The Indus Valley civilization reminds us that civilizational collapse is not always catastrophic in the sense of sudden, violent ending. Sometimes it is simply the long, slow draining away of everything that made a place special, the networks that connected it, the surpluses that enriched it, the administrative sophistication that organized it, the water that sustained all of the above. The Harappans adapted as best they could. Their descendants survive. But the civilization they built, the most urbanized, the most sophisticated, the most mysteriously gifted in urban planning of any Bronze Age culture, exists today only in the patient work of archaeologists and in the mute evidence of ruins that have not yet told us their full story. Perhaps the water took that story with it when it left. Visual. A final close-up of an undeciphered Indus seal. The carved pictographs of animals and symbols that no one has yet learned to read. The seal held up against the light, the camera holding on its mystery. 16:9 widescreen. SFX. Absolute silence. Then, very slowly, the sound of wind across open water, the sound of a river that is no longer there. Expansion. The children of the Sarasvati. What the Harappan cities reveal about adaptation. Visual. An aerial view of Dholavira, the largest Harappan city in what is now India's Rann of Kutch, showing its extraordinary water conservation infrastructure. The massive reservoirs cut into the bedrock visible from above, connected by channels to the city's water distribution system. A civilization that had anticipated water scarcity and engineered against it. Cinematic oil painting, the desert landscape of Kutch framing the extraordinary water infrastructure. 16:9 widescreen. SFX. The sounds of water in Dholavira's reservoir system. The sound of collected rainwater flowing through channels into storage. The sounds of people drawing water for household use. The life-supporting sound of water preserved in an arid landscape. Of all the Harappan cities, Dholavira is perhaps the most instructive about the relationship between the Indus civilization and water, not because it thrived despite water scarcity, but because it was specifically designed around the management of water scarcity. Located on the island of Kadiabet in the Rann of Kutch, a salt marsh in what is now Gujarat, one of the most arid parts of the Indian subcontinent, Dholavira occupied a landscape where seasonal freshwater availability was always limited and rainfall was always uncertain. The city's builders knew this. They did not settle there despite the water scarcity. They settled there in part because the geology of the island, bisected by two seasonal streams, offered opportunities for water conservation that the builders were equipped to exploit. The result was the most elaborate urban water management system in the Bronze Age world. Visual. A detailed reconstruction of Dholavira's water infrastructure. The massive reservoir carved into the limestone bedrock, the stone-lined channels connecting them to the seasonal streams, the distribution system delivering water to different city sectors, the engineering detail precise and impressive, documentary visualization in cinematic oil painting style, 16:9 widescreen. SFX. The sounds of a sophisticated urban water management system. Water flowing through stone channels, being directed and collected. The ambient sounds of a city whose relationship with water has been carefully engineered. The sound of a civilization that has thought about water with great precision. Dholavira's reservoir system included at least 16 major storage tanks, some of them cut directly into the rock, others constructed of dressed stone. The largest could hold several million litres of water. The system was designed to capture every drop of the seasonal stream flow and the monsoon rainfall and store it against the long dry season that followed. This was not reactive engineering, not the desperate modification of a system designed for better conditions. This was prospective engineering, a city built from its founding with the explicit recognition that water would always be scarce here, and with the deliberate construction of a system capable of making scarce water sufficient. The Harappan builders who designed Dolavira had understood something fundamental. The water problem could be engineered around, but only if you started by acknowledging that the problem existed. Visual, a close-up of the stone-lined channels at Dolavira, the precision of the construction visible in the tight-fitting stone blocks, the gradient of the channel designed to move water efficiently without erosion, the outlets calibrated for controlled flow, the engineering sophistication of a 4,500-year-old water management system, 16.9 widescreen, SFX, water moving through the ancient stone channel, a precise, efficient sound, the sound of engineering that knows exactly what it is doing, the satisfaction of a well-designed system working. And yet Dolavira, for all its hydraulic sophistication, was eventually abandoned. The monsoon that fed its streams and filled its reservoirs grew less reliable in the centuries after 2000 BCE. The seasonal streams that the city's engineers had so carefully captured became less predictable, sometimes flooding catastrophically, sometimes barely flowing at all. The storage system that had been designed for a particular pattern of seasonal water availability became less adequate as that pattern shifted. The final abandonment of Dolavira appears to have been gradual, the city contracting over decades as the water supply became less reliable, the population declining as people found the hydraulic system's outputs insufficient for their needs, until the remaining population reached a point at which maintaining the infrastructure was no longer possible for the reduced community. The reservoirs that had made Dolavira possible became, in the end, too large for the population that remained to maintain. The channels silted, the outlets blocked. The elaborate system returned, slowly, to the limestone and the desert. What Dolavira tells us is not that the Harappans failed to adapt. They adapted with extraordinary skill. What it tells us is that there are limits to what even excellent engineering can accomplish when the fundamental climatic input, the rainfall that feeds the seasonal streams, has shifted beyond the system's design parameters. You can engineer around water scarcity. You cannot engineer away a drought. Visual, Dolavira today. The excavated reservoirs visible as impressive cuts in the bedrock, the site in the modern Rann of Kutch landscape. The water management system still legible after 45 centuries, researchers at work in the site, the engineering achievement of the Harappans visible and documented, but the water it was designed to manage long gone. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the modern sounds of the Rann of Kutch, the dry wind off the salt marsh, the distant cry of waterbirds in the seasonal wetlands, the sounds of the researchers working. The reservoir cuts in the rock receive nothing. The water is elsewhere. Expansion, the faces of famine, the human cost in the first intermediate period. Visual, a dramatic reconstruction of an Egyptian village during the first intermediate period famine. The mud brick houses smaller and more crowded than in the Old Kingdom's affluent years. The granary visible at the edge of the village at a fraction of its normal capacity. People moving through the streets with the careful economy of movement that comes from chronic inadequate nutrition. The scene rendered with historical accuracy and human empathy. Cinematic oil painting. The warm Egyptian light unable to disguise the hardship of the scene. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the sounds of a famine-stressed Egyptian village. Quieter than a normal village, the children's voices fewer and less energetic, the market sounds reduced, the sound of grinding grain taken more slowly than usual to make the supply last longer, the sounds of a community managing scarcity. The texts of the first intermediate period are extraordinary documents of a civilization in crisis. They are not official propaganda. The Old Kingdom's confident royal proclamations have been replaced by something rawer, more personal, more willing to say what is actually happening. The Ipuwer Papyrus, the most dramatic of these texts, has been variously interpreted as a literal description of famine conditions, as a literary lamentation in a traditional genre, and as a polemical text written to criticize specific royal failures. It is probably all three simultaneously, a literary form that had the specific content of actual disaster to draw on. What makes it particularly valuable is the specific detail of the collapse it describes. This is not general lamentation but particular observation, specific things that have stopped working, specific reversals of normal social order, specific evidence of a world turned wrong. Visual, a close-up of the Ipuwer papyrus in its museum case. The hieratic script of the text readable in its brushstroke characters, the document damaged at its edges but its substance preserved. A document written in crisis, preserved by the accident of survival through millennia. Archival warm amber light. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the museum quiet around the papyrus. Then, slowly, the ambient sounds of the world the papyrus described. A famine-stressed landscape, wind over dry fields, the distant sound of social disorder. The desert is throughout the land. The nomes are destroyed. Barbarians from outside have come to Egypt. Foreigners have become people everywhere. This last observation, foreigners everywhere, is significant in ways that the modern climate and collapse literature has highlighted. The migrants and raiders that Egyptian texts describe as arriving from outside in the First Intermediate Period were not, in all likelihood, invaders motivated by imperial ambition. They were people driven from their own drought-stressed lands by the same climatic conditions that were stressing Egypt. The 4.2 kilo-year event was a global phenomenon. The drought that weakened the Nile floods and strained Egyptian agriculture was accompanied by drought across the Levant, across the Arabian Peninsula, and across North Africa. The foreigners who pressed into Egypt were, in all likelihood, themselves refugees from drought, people whose own agricultural systems had collapsed before Egypt's did, who were moving toward the Nile because the Nile was still, however reduced, a more reliable water source than what they had left behind. The meeting of Egyptian famine and migrant pressure was thus not an Egyptian problem encountering an external force. It was the meeting of two expressions of the same global drought, one that had collapsed the migrants' home regions and one that was currently collapsing Egypt itself. Visual, a map of the 4.2 kilo-year drought across the region, Egypt, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and the Arabian Peninsula, each showing drought severity in a graduated colour scale. Migration arrow showing the movement of peoples from the most severely affected areas toward the Nile, which appears as a relatively more stable resource in the broader landscape of regional catastrophe. Documentary visualization in warm cinematic colours, 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the ambient sounds of migration, the sounds of travel, of large groups moving across dry landscapes, the sounds of displacement rather than invasion, people fleeing rather than conquering, the difference audible in the quality of the movement. The nomarch inscriptions that survive from this period, carved into the tombs of provincial governors who maintained regional authority after the central state's collapse, provide a ground-level view of how communities actually managed the crisis. At Moala, a provincial governor named Ancestral describes in extraordinary detail his own region's response to famine, how he sent his own grain to neighbouring regions whose need was even greater, how he maintained his population when others starved, how he organised labour to keep the agricultural system functioning. All of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger to such a degree that every man was eating his children, the inscription states. A hyperbole, almost certainly, but one that conveys the scale of what the nomarch understood himself to be managing against. The nomarchs who could feed their regions, through careful husbandry of grain reserves, through the organisational capacity to distribute food equitably, through the authority to prevent hoarding and speculation, kept their communities alive. Those who could not manage the famine lost authority, population, and ultimately their positions. The First Intermediate Period was, from a governance perspective, a brutal natural experiment in which the Old Kingdom's centralised redistributive system was replaced, by force of circumstances, by decentralised provincial management. The provinces that survived were those whose local leadership had the competence and the resources to manage the drought without the central system's support. Visual, an Egyptian nomarch's granary, the provincial storage facility that was now the primary food security institution for its region, the central state's redistributive function having collapsed, the nomarch overseeing the careful management of stores that must last until the Nile floods return, the weight of responsibility visible in the composition, cinematic oil painting, 16.9 widescreen, SFX, the sounds of careful rationing, grain being measured in small portions, the silence of a population listening to how much there is and calculating how long it must last, the quiet arithmetic of survival. The human cost of the first intermediate period famine cannot be quantified with precision, but the demographic evidence from the period suggests significant population decline in the most severely affected regions of Upper Egypt. Skeletal remains from this period show markers of nutritional stress, growth interruptions recorded in teeth and bones that are the physical signatures of childhood malnutrition, at rates elevated above the Old Kingdom baseline. People were hungry, children were hungry, the bones remember what the texts describe, but the Egyptian civilization did not end. It contracted, reorganized, suffered, and then, as the climate gradually stabilized and the Nile floods recovered in the 20th century BCE, it reunified under the Middle Kingdom pharaohs and rebuilt. The rebuilding took generations. The trauma was real and lasting. The theology was changed by it. The political structure was changed by it. The artistic conventions were changed by it. The Middle Kingdom that emerged was, in important ways, a different Egypt from the Old Kingdom that had preceded the disaster, but it was Egypt, transformed, humbled, more anxious and more humanly expressive than the serene divine confidence of the Pyramid Age, but Egypt nonetheless. Civilizations are more resilient than their worst crises suggest, but the crises leave marks that do not disappear in a generation. Visual, a Middle Kingdom sculpture, a portrait of a pharaoh rendered in the new, more humanly expressive style of the period. The face is recognizably royal, but not transcendently divine in the way of Old Kingdom portraiture. There are lines around the eyes. The expression is thoughtful rather than serenely confident. A civilization that has been through something and knows it. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the sound of stone being carefully worked. A sculptor's chisel, precise and methodical, creating a face that is trying to capture something new. The human within the divine, the sound of art that has been changed by what a civilization has been through. Expansion, the arithmetic of survival, how drought changes the calculus of civilization. Visual, a split screen showing two farming families, one in good years, one in drought years. The left panel shows a family with full granaries, healthy children, animals in good condition, the small luxuries that surplus permits. The right panel shows the same family, or a family like them, in the drought's third year, the granary half empty, the children thinner, the animals reduced in number, the luxuries gone, the decision horizon shrunk to the immediate question of how to last until the next harvest. Cinematic oil painting, the contrast precise and empathetic. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, left panel, the sounds of household prosperity, a child laughing, grain being poured generously, animals well fed in a nearby pen. Right panel, the quieter, more careful sounds of household scarcity, grain being measured in smaller portions, the reduced animal sounds, the absence of the child's laughter. There is a mathematical reality to drought and civilization that deserves to be stated plainly, because it underlies everything else in this documentary. Complex civilization is surplus made social. When an agricultural system produces more than its farmers need to survive, the excess, the surplus, can be used to support people who don't farm: priests, administrators, soldiers, architects, artists, merchants, teachers. Every layer of complexity above basic subsistence is funded by surplus. This seems obvious. But its implications for drought resilience are not always appreciated. The surplus that sustains civilizational complexity is typically a relatively thin layer above the subsistence floor. In productive regions with reliable rainfall, the surplus might be substantial, 20, 30, even 40% of production above subsistence needs. In marginal agricultural regions, the surplus might be much smaller, 10% in good years, barely 5% in average ones. A drought that reduces production by 20% eliminates a civilization's entire surplus if that surplus was 20% to begin with, it plunges a civilization below subsistence, into famine if the surplus was thinner. Visual, a visual representation of the surplus-subsistence relationship. A bar chart showing agricultural production in good years, the subsistence floor marked as a fixed line, the surplus as the area above it. Then drought. The bar shrinks, the surplus disappears. In some years the bar falls below the subsistence line entirely. Clean documentary visualization in warm cinematic palette. 16.9 widescreen. SFX. The sounds of the visualization are the sounds of the economy it represents. In good years, the busy sounds of a surplus-funded civilization. As the bar shrinks, those sounds reduce. When the bar falls below the subsistence line, the sounds become the sounds of crisis. But here is the deeper problem. The civilization doesn't know at the start of a drought that it is at the start of a drought. In the first drought year, the administrators of any of the civilizations in this documentary would have understood their situation as a bad year, to be managed by drawing on reserves, adjusting distributions, tightening belts, and waiting for next year's rain. Pre-modern civilizations had managed bad years before. Every agricultural society maintains some form of reserve against bad years, and every administrative tradition includes protocols for managing reduced supply. What they could not know was whether they were managing a bad year or the beginning of a multi-decade drought. This epistemic limitation, the inability to know in real time whether you're experiencing a temporary fluctuation or a permanent change, may be the single most important factor in understanding why these civilizations responded as they did. The actions that make sense when you believe you are managing a temporary crisis are very different from the actions that would be appropriate for a permanent climatic shift. Visual, a Khmer administrator in the third year of reduced monsoon rainfall, looking at the water level in the Barre, comparing it to the seasonal record, making calculations. The uncertainty on his face real. Is this a bad year or the beginning of something worse? The moment of epistemic limitation, the inability to know what kind of problem you are actually facing. 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the sound of quiet calculation, water being measured, notes being compared, the thinking sounds of a man trying to determine what situation he is actually in, the uncertainty audible in the pauses. The rational response to a temporary crisis is to draw down reserves and wait for recovery. The rational response to a permanent shift is to fundamentally restructure the civilization's relationship to water, move to different locations, adopt different agricultural methods, reduce population to levels the changed environment can support. But the second response is only rational if you know that's what you're facing, and you can only know that retrospectively, after the drought has continued long enough that a permanent shift becomes undeniable. By the time a multi-decade drought has continued long enough to be identified as permanent rather than temporary, the reserves that could have funded a managed restructuring have been consumed by the years of managing it as a temporary crisis. The resources needed to build the new hydraulic infrastructure, to develop the new agricultural systems, to provision the migration to better watered regions, all of it has been spent on waiting for the rain that did not come. This temporal trap, this combination of uncertainty about the nature of the crisis and the progressive consumption of adaptive resources while the uncertainty persists, is perhaps the deepest explanation for why sophisticated civilizations failed to adapt to droughts that ultimately destroyed them. They were not stupid. They were doing what was rational given what they knew, and what they knew was never enough in time to save them. Visual, a final image, a drought-struck ancient landscape at dusk, the farms and cities of civilization visible in the middle distance, the sky above cloudless and indifferent. In the foreground, a single figure, the administrator, the farmer, the ordinary person in the impossible situation, looking at the sky with a particular expression of someone who has been waiting for something that is taking too long to arrive. Not despair, not resignation, just waiting and hoping and not knowing. 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the silence of waiting for rain. The particular silence of a landscape that should have water in it and does not. Wind, the sound of dryness. And under it, barely audible, the sound that everyone in that landscape is listening for and not hearing, the sound of rain not arriving. Chapter 8, When the Nile Forgot Its Promise. The Collapse of Old Kingdom Egypt, 2200-2050. BCE. Visual, a sweeping panoramic view of Old Kingdom Egypt at its absolute height. The pyramids of Giza newly completed and gleaming white with Tura limestone casing, the Nile reflecting golden morning light in its annual inundation, the agricultural floodplain green and abundant on both banks, the civilization at the peak of its confidence and power, cinematic oil painting with the luminous quality of a great historical canvas, 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the ancient sounds of Old Kingdom Egypt in the inundation season, water flowing across the floodplain, the distant sound of temple ceremonies, the movement of boats on the Nile, birds calling in the reed beds along the riverbank. The civilization of ancient Egypt was, in an important sense, not really built on land at all. It was built on water, the Nile flood, arriving with extraordinary regularity each summer, depositing the rich silt that made the floodplain the most productive agricultural land in the ancient Mediterranean world, then receding to leave the soil ready for planting, was so central to Egyptian civilization that the Egyptians divided their calendar around it. Akhet, the inundation season; Peret, the growing season; Shemu, the harvest. Year after year, millennia after millennia, the cycle repeated, each revolution sustained by the extraordinary reliability of East African monsoon rains, falling on the Ethiopian highlands and flowing north through the Nile's length to the Egyptian delta. This reliability was the foundation on which everything else rested. The agricultural surplus that the Nile flood made possible was what allowed Egyptian civilization to maintain the elaborate bureaucratic, religious and artistic institutions that made it recognizably Egyptian. The granaries of Egypt, full of Nile-made grain, were what made Egypt the great power of the ancient world, capable of building the pyramids, of projecting military force across the Near East, of attracting merchants from every corner of the Mediterranean. Visual, a dramatic wide shot of the Nile in full inundation, the agricultural floodplain submerged to the edge of the desert, the villages on their elevated mounds rising from the water like islands, the Nile itself invisible beneath the broader expanse of the flood, boats moving across what is normally dry farmland, a civilization adapted to and dependent on this extraordinary annual event. 16.9 widescreen, SFX, the particular sound of the Nile inundation, not a river in its banks but a landscape in water, the sound of a vast shallow flood moving slowly across a flat plain, the calls of water birds in the unusual places, the lap of water against village walls. The pharaoh's most fundamental religious obligation was to ensure that the flood came at the right time, in the right volume, and receded at the right moment. This was not understood as a metaphorical responsibility. It was a literal one, mediated through the pharaoh's relationship with the gods. A good inundation was evidence of divine favour. A bad one, too low, too high, too late, too early, was evidence that something had gone wrong in the relationship between the pharaoh and the divine order. For most of the Old Kingdom period, roughly 2686 to 2181 BCE, the Nile cooperated magnificently. The great pyramid building projects of the 4th dynasty, including the pyramids of Giza, were undertaken at a moment of climatic stability and agricultural abundance that made such extraordinary expenditures of labour and resources possible. A state that could build the Great Pyramid had surplus to burn, surplus labour, surplus food, surplus organisational capacity. Then, around 2200 BCE, at almost exactly the same time that the Akkadian Empire was collapsing in Mesopotamia and drought was striking the Indus Valley, the pattern changed. Visual, a graphic showing the Nile gauge records, the ancient Nilometers that Egyptian administrators used to measure the flood's height, translated into a climate chart showing the dramatic drop in flood levels beginning around 2200 BCE. The visual transition from reliable annual readings to the chaos of low flood and no flood years, scientific documentary aesthetic embedded in warm historical context, 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the sound of a Nilometer measurement being made, a voice calling out a number, another voice recording it on papyrus, then the sound of a number too low to be spoken with confidence, silence where there should be a reassuring figure. The East African monsoon weakened. The rains that fell on the Ethiopian highlands and fed the Blue Nile, which contributes about 80% of the Nile's annual flood volume, became less reliable. The Nile floods dropped. In some years they dropped catastrophically, below the level necessary to water the full extent of the floodplain. In ancient Egypt, a low Nile year was not merely an agricultural setback, it was a systemic crisis. The redistributive system that the Old Kingdom pharaohs had built to move grain from surplus regions to deficit regions depended on there being surplus regions. When the flood was low across the entire Nile Valley simultaneously, as it was in multiple successive years during the drought of 2200-2150 BCE, there were no surplus regions, there was only deficit. What followed was one of the most dramatic social convulsions in Egyptian history. The texts from this period, the First Intermediate Period, as Egyptologists call the chaotic era that followed the Old Kingdom's collapse, are extraordinary documents of crisis. A text attributed to a man named Ipuwer describes a world turned upside down. The wealthy are impoverished, the poor hold gold, the Nile is blood, foreigners have come into Egypt, children are killed, the land lacks order. Visual, a close-up of ancient papyrus text, the hieratic script of the Ipuwer papyrus, dense lines of lament. The camera slowly pulls back to show the full document, then the museum case that contains it, the distance between the text and its modern viewers suggesting the gulf of millennia, archival documentary aesthetic, warm amber light, 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the scratch of a scribe's brush on papyrus, then, under it, the sound of weeping, distant and small but unmistakable. The river is blood. Men drink from it. Men thirst for water. That is our welfare. What shall we do for it? All is ruin. Men of violence are everywhere. This is the voice of a civilization in shock. Not shocked by invasion, though there were migrations into the delta from surrounding regions, driven by the same drought that was hitting Egypt. Not shocked by political conspiracy, shocked by the failure of the thing that had always been reliable, the thing that the entire culture was organized around, the thing the pharaoh existed to ensure. The Nile had failed. The royal tomb inscriptions from this period are haunting in what they reveal about the collapse of the Old Kingdom's administrative system. Nomarchs, provincial governors who had administered their regions in the name of the pharaoh, record feeding their own populations when the central redistribution system had nothing to offer. I gave bread to the hungry, clothing to the naked, these inscriptions boast, with a pride that reveals how extraordinary such basic provision had become in a society that had taken it for granted for centuries. The central state could no longer fulfill the redistributive functions that had justified its authority. Power devolved to the provincial level. The pharaonic court fragmented. A series of short-reigning, politically weak pharaohs followed the confident builders of the Old Kingdom's pyramids. Visual, a wide shot of the Nile at low water, the riverbeds exposed, the floodplain cracked and unplanted, the silhouette of the pyramids of Giza visible in the far distance against a bleached sky. The monuments of peak Old Kingdom confidence standing above a landscape that can no longer sustain the civilization that built them. Cinematic oil painting, the scale of the contrast deliberate and devastating. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the sound of low-water Nile, a reduced diminished flow, the exposed riverbank audible in the absence of the flood's familiar sound, dry wind across cracked earth. The First Intermediate Period lasted roughly 120+ years. It was a period of regional fragmentation, political competition between rival dynasties, and documented famines that killed unknown numbers of people. Then, as the climate gradually stabilized and the Nile floods recovered, a reunification occurred under the rulers of Thebes, the Middle Kingdom pharaohs who brought Egypt back together. But the Egypt that emerged was different from the Egypt that had preceded the collapse. The confident theological absolutism of Old Kingdom pharaonic power, the pharaoh as god, the pyramid as demonstration of the state's unlimited capacity or it was tempered. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs presented themselves in more human terms. The literary culture of the Middle Kingdom is richer in personal expression, in individual voice, in something that looks more like doubt than the serene divine confidence of Old Kingdom art. Having watched a civilization built on divine guarantee fall apart when the divine guarantee, the reliable Nile, failed to materialize, the Egyptians emerged from the crisis with a subtler, more anxious relationship to their own theology. They knew now that the river could fail, and they would never entirely forget it. Visual, a final image, a close-up of a Middle Kingdom pharaoh's face, rendered in the new, slightly more human style of the period. The features are refined but not transcendent, the expression thoughtful rather than sublimely confident. A civilization that has learned something about the limits of divine guarantee. Archival documentary aesthetic, warm light. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the sound of the Nile. The normal, reliable, life-giving sound of a great river running in its banks, beautiful and trustworthy, for now. Chapter 9. The Altiplano dries out. Tiwanaku and the lake. Titicaca drought, 900 to 1200 CE. Visual, a sweeping aerial shot of the Tiwanaku ceremonial complex at its height, the Akapana Pyramid Mound, the Kalasasaya platform with its carved gateway of the sun, the Puma Punku complex in the distance. All of this set against the extraordinary backdrop of the Bolivian Altiplano, the vast flat plain at 3,800 meters elevation, the snow-capped Andes rising beyond, Lake Titicaca glittering in the distance, a civilization at the roof of the world, cinematic oil painting with the vivid high-altitude light of the Andes, 69 widescreen. SFX, the sounds of the Altiplano at 3,800 meters, the thin-air wind, distant music of panpipes and drums, the movement of llama herds, the extraordinary silence of an Andean dawn before human activity begins. They built their civilization at the edge of what most civilizations would consider impossible. The Bolivian Altiplano is one of the most hostile agricultural environments on Earth. At nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, the thin air delivers less oxygen with every breath. Frost can strike any month of the year. Rainfall is scarce and unpredictable, most of it falling in a narrow wet season between October and April, with the rest of the year bone dry. The growing season is brutally short. The soils, where they exist at all, are often poor and saline, and yet, around this unpromising landscape and the enormous cold high-altitude lake at its heart, Lake Titicaca, the Tiwanaku civilization built one of the most sophisticated agricultural systems and one of the most spiritually powerful ceremonial complexes in South America. Visual, a dramatic wide shot of the raised field systems around Lake Titicaca, the Suca Colossus visible as a pattern of alternating ridges and channels across the lakeside plain, their geometry still partially legible from the air, the lake visible beyond enormous and blue-grey at altitude, 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the sound of water moving through the channels between raised fields, a quiet, steady flow that transformed a frost-prone wetland into productive agricultural land, the sound of an ingenious solution to an impossible problem. The raised field technology that the Tiwanaku people developed was a masterpiece of ecological engineering adapted precisely to their environment. In the wetland margins around Lake Titicaca, they constructed platforms of soil raised above the waterlogged ground, separated by channels of standing water. This system worked on multiple levels simultaneously. The channels drained the fields in the wet season, preventing waterlogging that would have killed the potato and quinoa crops. In the dry season, the channels provided irrigation, drawing on the lake's water table to keep the roots of crops supplied. Most importantly, the open water in the channels absorbed solar radiation during the day and released it as heat at night, raising the temperature in the field zones by several degrees Celsius and dramatically reducing the frost risk that would otherwise have made reliable crop production at this altitude nearly impossible. The result was a productive agricultural system operating in an environment that, without this engineering, could barely support subsistence farming. The surplus generated by this system sustained a growing urban population at Tiwanaku itself, fed the craft specialists who produced the extraordinary stonework of the ceremonial centre, and provisioned the llama caravans that moved Tiwanaku goods and Tiwanaku influence across the Andes and down to the Pacific coast. Visual, a reconstruction of the Tiwanaku agricultural system in operation, the raised field platforms with growing crops, the channels between them reflecting the high-altitude sky, farmers working in the fields, llama herds grazing on the raised platform margins. A civilization that had transformed the most hostile agricultural environment on the continent into a food-producing system of extraordinary efficiency. Cinematic oil painting, the colours of the Altiplano vivid and specific. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the busy sounds of an agricultural civilization at work, tools in soil, water in channels, the calls of farmers across fields, the bells of llamas in the distance, the sounds of a landscape that has been made productive by human ingenuity. At its height, between roughly 400 and 1000 CE, Tiwanaku was the dominant power in the south-central Andes, Its iconography, the staff god, the gateway of the sun, the distinctive geometric patterns, spread across an enormous area through trade, colonization, and religious influence. Its colonies in the lower valleys provided access to maize, coca, and other crops that the Altiplano could not produce. Its control of the lapis lazuli trade routes gave it access to one of the most precious materials in the Andean world, the gateway of the sun at Calasasaya, carved from a single block of andesite, its central figure surrounded by 48 attendants, each a different day of the Tiwanaku ceremonial calendar, is one of the supreme artistic achievements of pre-Columbian South America. It stands today, slightly cracked from some ancient seismic event, but still monumental, still conveying the extraordinary ambition and skill of the civilization that made it. That civilization, the climate record tells us, ran out of water. Visual, a close-up of the gateway of the sun at Tiwanaku, the central carved figure, the weeping eyes that are a distinctive mark of Tiwanaku iconography, the rows of attendant figures below, the stone worn by centuries but the carving still detailed, still communicating across the gulf of time, dramatic raking light on the carved surface, 16.9 widescreen, SFX, wind moving across the Altiplano, the particular thin, high-altitude wind that sounds different from wind at lower elevations, drier and colder, the silence of the ruins behind the wind. The sediment records from Lake Titicaca are among the most detailed climate archives in South America, and what they show for the period between approximately 900 and 1200 CE is a sustained and severe drought, a reduction in the lake's level of 10 to 15 meters below its modern height. For a civilization whose agricultural system depended on the lake's water table to supply the channels between raised fields, a drop of 10 meters was catastrophic. The channels dried out. The thermal buffering that had made frost-resistant agriculture possible at this altitude ceased to function. Crop after crop failed. The response was initially vigorous. Tiwanaku expanded its highland colonies and intensified its exploitation of lower altitude areas where alternative agricultural systems were possible. Caravans moved more goods over longer distances as the Altiplano's productivity declined. The ceremonial centre at Tiwanaku itself continued operating, but the agricultural foundation of the system was gone. A civilization that had been able to sustain an urban population of perhaps 30 or 40,000 people at the ceremonial centre, plus tens of thousands more independent communities across the region, now found itself unable to feed its dependents. Visual, a wide shot of the Altiplano during a drought period, the vast flat plain bleached and dry, Lake Titicaca visible in the distance at a dramatically lower level, the exposed shoreline pale and chalky where the water has retreated, the raised field platforms in the middle ground empty and unworked, the scale of agricultural abandonment visible, 16.9 widescreen, SFX, the silence of abandoned fields, the wind moving over unworked ground, the absence of the sounds of agricultural activity that once defined this landscape, distant llama bells fading as the herds move away. By around 1000 CE, Tiwanaku was in collapse. The outlying colonies were abandoned. The caravan routes that had integrated the highland and lowland zones ceased functioning. The urban population of the ceremonial centre dispersed. The elaborate administrative and redistribution system that had moved goods across the Andes collapsed for lack of goods to move. The stonework was left where it stood, the gateway of the sun still upright. The Pumapunku's H-block scattered by an earthquake, the Acapana mound eroding in the Andean rains and frost. Later cultures encountered these ruins and explained them as the work of giants, or of the creator god Viracocha, who had made the world here before making humanity. The idea that ordinary humans, clever, organised, well-fed ordinary humans, had carved andesite to this precision and erected it with this ambition, did not fit the post-collapse world's sense of what was possible. The ruins were too big for the world the drought had left behind. Visual, a final wide shot of the Tiwanaku ceremonial complex at dusk, the gateway of the sun silhouetted against the extraordinary Altiplano sky, Lake Titicaca glittering silver in the distance, the Andes rising beyond, the ruins small against the vastness of the landscape that outlasted them, cinematic oil painting, the colours of the high-altitude dusk extraordinary, 16.9 widescreen, SFX, panpipes, distant, high, achingly beautiful, playing a traditional Andean melody. The music carries across the Altiplano and then fades into the wind. The wind continues alone. Chapter 10: The Science of Silenced Skies. How we read the droughts of the ancient world. Visual: a montage of paleoclimate research tools. A scientist lowering a coring device into a lake. A close-up of a stalagmite being cut on a precision saw. Tree ring samples in a laboratory. Ice cores extracted from the Greenland ice sheet laid out in a freezing cold storage facility. Marine sediment cores in labelled cylinders. The visual language of cutting-edge science in service of ancient history. Documentary aesthetic. Cool blue laboratory light contrasting with warm amber historical context. 16.9 widescreen. SFX. The sounds of scientific precision. The hum of laboratory equipment. The precise click of measuring instruments. A researcher's quiet voice describing a sample. The steady background hum of a freezer unit preserving irreplaceable ice core samples. We have spent 9 chapters describing droughts that ended civilizations. Now it is worth pausing to ask, how do we know? How do we know, with the confidence that modern paleoclimatologists express, that a drought struck the Akkadian heartland around 2200 BCE? How do we know that the classic Maya suffered prolonged drought between 800 and 900 CE? How do we reconstruct the monsoon history of Southeast Asia across a millennium when the civilizations that experienced it left no systematic weather records? The answer is that the Earth itself is an archive. The planet records its own climate history in materials that survive, sometimes for millions of years, waiting for scientists to learn how to read them. The reading of that archive has been one of the great scientific achievements of the past half-century. Visual: an extreme close-up of a stalagmite cross-section, the concentric layers of calcium carbonate visible as alternating light and dark bands, each layer a year's deposit, each deposit carrying chemical signatures of the rainfall that created it. The beauty of the natural record visible in the precision of the structure. Scientific documentary aesthetic. 16.9 widescreen. SFX: the drip of water in a limestone cave, the sound that created the stalagmite, one infinitesimal calcium deposit at a time, year after year for millennia. Speleothems, the collective term for cave formations like stalagmites and stalactites, are among the most powerful paleoclimate archives available. They form as rainwater dissolves limestone and then redeposits calcium carbonate in caves, building up layer by layer as the water drips. The chemistry of each layer encodes the conditions under which the water fell and flowed through the rock above. The ratio of oxygen isotopes, oxygen 16 to oxygen 18, changes depending on the mountain source of rainfall. More rainfall, enhanced by monsoon dynamics, creates one isotope signature. Dry conditions create another. By measuring these ratios through successive layers with mass spectrometry instruments of extraordinary precision, scientists can reconstruct rainfall records going back hundreds of thousands of years. The Donga Cave stalagmite in China, for example, has provided a 9,000-year reconstruction of the East Asian monsoon. The Kunf Cave stalagmite in Oman has illuminated the monsoon history of the Arabian Sea region. The Belize Speleothem record has been central to understanding the drought history of the Maya lowlands. Each of these records, developed independently by different research teams in different laboratories on different continents, tells part of the same global story. Climate variations that seemed local are often connected across vast distances, driven by changes in the same ocean-atmosphere dynamics that affect multiple regions simultaneously. Visual: a world map showing paleoclimate archive locations, the dots representing ice cores, speleothem sites, lake sediment cores, tree ring networks, and marine sediment cores clustered across every continent and ocean basin. The map pulses gently as connections between synchronized climate events are drawn across the distances separating them. Documentary visualization, warm and readable. 16.9 widescreen. SFX: the quiet sound of data being processed, a computer running models, the occasional electronic beep of a successful analysis, the background hum of scientific computation. Lake sediments offer another extraordinary archive. Lakes receive input from their surrounding watersheds, soil particles, pollen, organic material, and this input is encoded in the sediment layers that accumulate on the lake floor. In years of high rainfall, the watershed delivers more material. In drought years, less. The chemistry of the deposited material changes with climate. Specific pollen types record the vegetation of the surrounding landscape, and vegetation responds to drought with diagnostic specificity. The technology for extracting and analysing these sediment cores has advanced dramatically over the past 2 decades. Sub-millimetre resolution sampling allows researchers to detect year-by-year climate variations in sediment columns that span thousands of years. Techniques like micro-XRF core scanning can map elemental compositions through an entire core non-destructively, generating datasets that capture climate signals at a resolution that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations of researchers. Visual, a researcher in a laboratory using a micro-XRF scanner to analyze a lake sediment core, the machine moving slowly along the core as data streams to a computer screen beside the researcher, the precision and patience of the science rendered in quiet documentary style, 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the mechanical sound of the XRF scanner moving along the core, a precise, methodical sound, the quiet click of data being captured, the researcher's focused breathing. Tree rings, dendrochronology, have been crucial particularly for the past 2,000 years and for regions where ancient trees or preserved ancient wood survives. Trees record drought in the thinness of their annual growth rings. In drought years, growth is reduced and the ring is narrow. In wet years, growth is abundant and the ring is wide. The precision of tree ring dating is extraordinary. Because every ring corresponds to exactly 1 year, a sufficiently long tree ring chronology provides a year-by-year record of climate conditions. And because ancient wooden beams from archaeological sites can often be cross-matched to living tree ring records through a statistical technique called cross-dating, tree ring chronologies can be extended back thousands of years using materials that are no longer living. The Southwest American Tree Ring Network, maintained by the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona, now covers the American Southwest with a climate record extending back more than 2,000 years. The network of tree ring chronologies across Southeast Asia has been crucial for reconstructing the monsoon history relevant to Angkor's decline. Visual, a researcher working with a cross-section of an ancient tree. The rings visible in extraordinary detail, narrow and wide years alternating in a readable record. The researcher's finger tracing a particularly thin cluster of rings, a sequence of drought years visible in the wood. Close-up documentary aesthetic. 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the quiet sound of scientific examination, a magnifying glass being repositioned, notes being written, the soft click of a measuring device, the centuries compressed into a wooden disc on a laboratory table. Marine sediment cores recover the record of deep ocean floor deposits that have been accumulating layer by layer for millions of years. The grains of aeolian dust, wind-blown particles from continental regions, that settle into ocean sediments are particularly valuable for drought research. More dust in the marine record means more wind-blown soil from drying continental surfaces, which means more drought. The Gulf of Oman cores that Harvey Weiss used to establish the Akkadian drought, showing a massive spike in terrigenous dust corresponding to the 4.2 kiloyear event, were a breakthrough precisely because they provided an independent, far-from-source confirmation of a drought event whose evidence in Mesopotamia itself could have been interpreted in multiple ways. Historical documents provide a fourth archive, one that the other techniques can calibrate and confirm. Ancient administrative texts recording grain prices and agricultural yields, diaries and letters describing weather conditions, annals recording famines and migrations, court documents noting the height of Nile floods. All of these encode climate information that can be cross-referenced with the physical archives. The marriage of historical and paleoclimate archives has been the defining methodological advance in drought and civilization research. Each type of evidence has its limitations. In combination, they constrain each other in ways that produce genuinely reliable historical reconstructions. Visual, a side-by-side display. On one side, an ancient clay tablet with administrative records. On the other, the corresponding section of a sediment core showing a drought layer. The two types of the evidence from the same historical moment, the connection between them illuminating both. Documentary visualization, the two evidence types bridging the distance between science and history. 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the sound of two worlds briefly touching, the scratch of an ancient scribe's stylus, and the click of a modern mass spectrometer, heard simultaneously for a moment, then separating back into their respective silences. What these combined archives have revealed, over the past 3 decades of intensive research, is something that has genuinely changed how historians and archaeologists understand the past. Climate was not merely a background condition for human history. It was an active agent in human history, shaping the possibilities and the limits of civilizational achievement in ways that the civilizations themselves often could not perceive. The Akkadian administrators who were recording ever-shrinking grain allocations in their final years did not write, "This is happening because of a large-scale reduction in the North Atlantic Oscillation's influence on Levantine winter rainfall patterns, combined with a weakening of the South Asian monsoon." They wrote about the gods. They wrote about the king. They wrote about the enemy. We can now, for the first time in history, read their story with the climate data in hand. And what we see, when we put the 2 archives together, is a civilization responding, sometimes resourcefully, sometimes desperately, sometimes wisely, and sometimes disastrously, to forces that were larger than any institutional response could fully address. The Earth has always been keeping records. We are only now learning to read them. Visual, a final image, a researcher sitting at a desk in a laboratory late at night, surrounded by printed climate graphs and photographs of ancient sites, a speleothem sample lit from beneath on the desk in front of her. She is doing what archaeologists and paleoclimatologists do, sitting at the intersection of the deep past and the present, reading a record that no one asked the Earth to keep, but that the Earth kept anyway. 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the quiet of a late-night laboratory, the hum of refrigeration equipment, a distant computer fan, the researcher's occasional movement. Outside the window, barely audible, the sound of rain. Expansion. The objects left behind. What abandoned cities preserve. Visual. A carefully organized display of objects recovered from drought-abandoned ancient sites. A Harappan seal with its undeciphered script. A Maya obsidian blade still sharp after 1,000 years. A Tang Dynasty bronze mirror with its geometric decoration. An Akkadian cylinder seal, its carved surface recording a scene of royal presentation that the king it celebrated never survived to see enacted. Objects that outlasted the civilizations that made them, arranged in quiet testimony. Archival documentary aesthetic, warm raking light on the objects. 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the museum quiet of preserved objects, the soft footfall of a researcher moving between display cases, the faint sound of climate control maintaining the temperature and humidity that keeps ancient materials intact, the sounds of the present protecting what the past left behind. Every civilization in this documentary left objects behind, not intentionally, not as a gift to the future or a message in a bottle, but simply because objects are harder to carry than knowledge, and when people leave in a hurry, or leave gradually with only what they can carry, they leave behind what is heaviest and most cumbersome. The result is a kind of accidental archive, the physical residue of civilizations that did not expect to be archaeological sites. The objects are mundane, mostly, pottery, tools, architectural elements, the everyday material culture of people living their ordinary lives interrupted, but they carry information that no text could fully provide, information about what daily life actually looked like, what people owned, what they valued enough to have made and kept, what was ordinary enough to leave behind when leaving became necessary. A Maya obsidian blade, found in the floor of an abandoned house, tells us about the trade networks that brought volcanic glass from highland Guatemala to the lowland cities. A Tang Dynasty bronze mirror found in a collapsed administrative office tells us about the material culture of Tang bureaucracy. An Akkadian seal found in the dust layer tells us about the administrative identity of the person who carried it and dropped it, or left it, in the moment of abandonment. Visual. A close-up of an archaeologist's careful hand brushing soil from an object in situ, the object emerging from the earth in which it has rested for millennia, seen for the first time since whoever left it walked away. The moment of excavation as a kind of meeting across time. Documentary close-up, 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the careful sounds of excavation, a soft brush moving over an emerging object, the breath of concentration, the moment of recognition when the shape of something becomes clear through the soil. Then a single beat of silence, the first human to touch this object in thousands of years, holding it. What strikes me most when I read the excavation reports from these abandoned sites is not the dramatic objects, the royal seals, the ceremonial items, the artistically significant artifacts, but the small ones, the ordinary ones, the grain still in the storage jar, left by someone who planned to come back for it, the child's sandal, dropped in the street and never retrieved, the half-finished tool on a craftsman's workbench, the work interrupted and never completed. These objects tell us that the people who left these places did not always know they were leaving forever. Some of them left expecting to return, to the house where the grain jar sat, to the workshop where the unfinished tool waited. The abandonment was not always understood as abandonment in the moment of its happening. The drought made the return impossible. The jar of grain remained, the sandal remained, the tool remained. And time did what time does to the objects of ordinary lives, until the archaeologists came and found what the drought had interrupted. In this sense, the abandoned cities of the ancient world are not primarily records of failure. They are records of ordinary life caught mid-motion by a force larger than any city. The grain in the jar was someone's dinner. The drought decided that dinner would never be eaten. The jar remembered for 4,000 years what the drought took. Visual, the final image. A single ancient storage jar still sealed, found in an excavation of a drought-abandoned site. The camera holds on it. Whatever was inside, grain, oil, wine, the preserved product of someone's agricultural labour, is long gone, transformed by centuries. But the jar remains, the seal still in place, still holding the shape of its original purpose even after everything it was meant to contain has vanished. 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the sound of a sealed jar being found. The soft sound of earth being cleared from it, the brush on its surface, then silence. The jar offers nothing. It has kept its secret for millennia. The drought took what was inside. The clay kept only the shape of keeping. Chapter 11. The Anatomy of Collapse. What every drought disaster has in common. Visual, a composite image. 7 of the civilizations covered in this documentary shown simultaneously in a grid, each at their peak followed by their abandonment. The Akkadian ziggurat and the Tel Leyland dust layer, the Mycenaean palace and the Bronze Age burning coastline, the Maya pyramid and the jungle reclaiming it, Angkor and the roots of the strangler figs, Chaco and the cliff dwellings, the Tang capital and the empty yellow river plain, Old Kingdom Egypt and the cracked Nile floodplain, each pair a complete story of rise and fall, cinematic montage aesthetic, 16:9 widescreen. SFX, a brief sonic montage, the sounds of each civilization in turn, Mesopotamian city noise, Greek harbour activity, Maya jungle ceremony, Angkor temple bells, Chaco canyon wind, Chinese court music, Egyptian Nile sounds, each playing for just a moment before fading, then silence. 7 civilizations, 4,000 years of history, every continent inhabited by complex societies, and the same story, told again and again with different names and different details but the same underlying structure. It is time to ask, what is that structure? What do these collapses have in common? And what does the pattern tell us about the fundamental vulnerabilities that drought exploits? The answer begins with a concept that climate scientists and complexity theorists call systemic risk. The vulnerability that emerges not from individual weak points, but from the way that multiple systems are interconnected so that the failure of one propagates rapidly through all the others. Visual, a visualization of systemic interconnection, a web of nodes representing agriculture, trade, political legitimacy, military capacity, religious authority and population, with lines connecting them. In the center, a water icon. As the water icon dims, the visualization shows how the failure propagates outward through the connections, dimming node after node in a cascade. Educational documentary visualization, warm and clear, 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the sound of a systemic cascade, starting from silence, then a single note going wrong, then others joining it, the dissonance spreading until the entire chord is unresolved, then silence again. Every complex pre-modern civilization rested on an agricultural base. This is so obvious that it barely seems worth stating, but the specific implications of that dependence are worth examining carefully. In every civilization we have examined, the agricultural base was calibrated to normal climate conditions. The infrastructure, the population size, the political complexity, the military capacity, all of these were scaled to what the climate normally provided. When the climate provided more than normal, there was surplus to invest in expansion. When it provided somewhat less, there was hardship, but the surplus reserves could absorb the shock. But none of these civilizations were calibrated for sustained, severe disruption of the climate patterns on which their agricultural systems depended. They couldn't be. The calibration required decades of normal conditions just to build the infrastructure that made the surplus possible in the first place. You cannot build a massive irrigation system in anticipation of a drought that may never come, because building the system requires the surplus that the drought would eliminate. This is the fundamental trap of hydraulic civilization. The most sophisticated and productive agricultural systems are also the most vulnerable to climate disruption, because they depend on specific, reliable climate inputs at every link in their production chain. Visual, a dramatic visual of a large-scale irrigation system, the network of channels spreading across a vast landscape, water moving through it in an intricate, coordinated flow. Then the water begins to slow, the channels begin to dry. The network that was a marvel of engineering becomes, as it empties, an expanse of dried mud and cracking clay. Cinematic oil painting, 16.9 widescreen, SFX, the sound of water diminishing in an irrigation channel, from the confident rush of a full-flowing system to a trickle to the sound of the last water reaching the end of the channel and stopping, then the dry sound of an empty channel in wind. The second common factor across all of these collapses was what we might call the political fragility of abundance-dependent legitimacy. Pre-modern states justified their authority in large part through their capacity to manage agricultural production and distribution. The Akkadian kings managed irrigation networks. The Khmer kings managed the beret system. The Maya kings interceded with the rain gods. The pharaoh guaranteed the Nile flood. The Chinese emperor held the mandate of heaven, which was understood to include climatic cooperation. When the climate failed, all of these legitimizing narratives were simultaneously undermined. The king who could not make it rain, or, more accurately, who could not make the rain come through the intermediary of divine relationship, was a king whose theological claim to authority had been disproved. In societies where political legitimacy was theologically grounded, and where theology included the expectation of agricultural abundance, a sustained drought was not just an agricultural crisis, it was a constitutional one, visual, a cinematic shot of a Maya king performing a bloodletting ritual, the act of royal self-sacrifice that was believed to communicate with the rain gods and ensure agricultural abundance. The ritual performed with complete commitment and desperate urgency. Now cut to, the crop still failing, the ritual having produced no rain. The gap between religious effort and physical reality visible in a single cut. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, the sounds of a Maya bloodletting ceremony. Drums, the hiss of an obsidian lancet, the chanting of priestly attendants, then the silence of dry fields in the aftermath. The third common factor was what drought researchers now call elite competition amplification. When resources are abundant, competition between elites, between aristocratic families, between regional commanders, between rival religious institutions, tends to be manageable. There is enough surplus for multiple claimants. The competition expresses itself in cultural production, architectural patronage, elaborate religious ceremony, diplomatic maneuvering. Expensive and sometimes wasteful, but not existentially destructive. When resources contract under drought stress, the same competition intensifies around a shrinking resource base. There is no longer enough for multiple claimants. Collaboration in managing shared infrastructure, irrigation systems, trade networks, redistribution systems, gives way to competition to control whatever is left. Warfare becomes rational, from an individual rational actor perspective, in a way that it was not when the alternative to war was peaceful participation in a productive shared system. The Bronze Age is perhaps the clearest example. the same international system that had made cooperation and long-distance trade profitable, shifted, under climate stress, into a system in which attacking your neighbours was more likely to feed your people than trading with them. The Sea Peoples were not pathological destroyers. They were people making rational choices in irrational circumstances, circumstances that the drought had created. Visual, a dramatic comparative visualization. On the left, a Bronze Age trading ship carrying cargo between two peaceful ports. On the right, the same ship type carrying warriors. The two images divided by a central line representing the drought, the trade world on one side, the raid world on the other. Documentary visualization, cinematic oil painting aesthetic, 16.9 widescreen. SFX, on the left, the sounds of a trading port, friendly voices, cargo being loaded, the sounds of commerce. On the right, the sounds of a raid, drums, shouts, the crash of oar against water in a military sprint. The contrast between the two worlds, absolute. The fourth common factor was infrastructure degradation. Every complex agricultural system requires maintenance. Irrigation channels silt up, reservoir embankments erode, terraces collapse, wells need deepening, drainage systems need clearing. This maintenance is not dramatic work. It is the quiet, continuous, collective labour of people who understand that the system they depend on will decay without constant attention. Under drought stress, this maintenance breaks down in multiple ways simultaneously. Labour diverted to food security cannot be applied to maintenance. Population decline reduces the available workforce. Political fragmentation eliminates the administrative authority that could organise collective maintenance projects. The decline in surplus eliminates the food rations that compensated maintenance workers. The result is a system that was already under climate stress becoming less capable of handling climate stress. The infrastructure that had made the society resilient to normal climate variation deteriorates precisely when it needs to be most robust. And the deteriorated infrastructure, when the drought finally breaks, is less capable of taking advantage of returning rainfall than it would have been if the maintenance had been sustained. Some droughts leave infrastructural damage that outlasts the drought itself by centuries. Visual, a split screen of the same irrigation system. On the left, maintained and functioning in normal times. On the right, after years of drought-induced maintenance failure, the channels silted, the embankments breached, the system unable to function even after the rains return. Documentary comparative visualization. 16.9 widescreen. SFX, left side, the sounds of a maintained system, water flowing, workers clearing channels, organizational activity. Right side, the sounds of a failed system, silence, wind, the faint drip of water finding its own course through unmaintained channels. The fifth and final common factor is the most humanly significant, the non-linearity of social collapse. People are enormously resilient. Communities can absorb extraordinary shocks, reduced harvests, political instability, increased conflict, and continue functioning. The history of drought-struck civilizations is not a story of immediate collapse the moment the rains fail. It is a story of years, sometimes decades, of creative adaptation, rationing, migration, diversification, intensification, institutional improvisation. The collapses we have described were not the immediate response to drought. They were the eventual failure of adaptive capacity after it had been stretched too far for too long by a sustained stress that was ultimately beyond the system's ability to absorb. This non-linearity means that collapse can look sudden from the outside, and in the archaeological record, even when it was the product of years of cumulative damage. The final straw is not the whole story. The full story is everything that came before it. The years of thinning surplus, the decades of compromised infrastructure, the generation of legitimacy erosion, the cumulative weight of elite competition and popular hardship. When the final blow came, whether the Sea People's assault, the Thai invasion of Angkor, the Gutian occupation of Akkad, the civilizations that fell had already been made fragile by everything that preceded it. Drought didn't break these civilizations. It made them brittle, and the world broke them. Visual, a final visualization, a glass vessel, beautifully made, representing a civilization. It is filled to the brim with water, the agricultural surplus that sustains it. Slowly, over the course of the visualization, the water level drops. The vessel doesn't break at first. Then, at some unpredictable moment, a single small impact, a tap with a fingertip, and it shatters. The water gone, the vessel gone, the pieces too small to reassemble. 16.9 widescreen. SFX. The sound of water slowly draining from a vessel, the small tap of a finger against glass, then the catastrophic crack and shatter, then silence, and the small sounds of water soaking into the ground beneath the broken pieces. Chapter 12. The River We Stand Beside. Drought, Civilization, and the Present Moment. Visual, a split screen of stunning parallel imagery. On the left, the dried bed of the Euphrates in ancient Mesopotamia, cracked and pale. On the right, the dried bed of the Colorado River as it crosses into Mexico today, also cracked and pale. On the left, an ancient Akkadian farmer standing at an empty irrigation channel. On the right, a modern farmer standing at a depleted wellhead in California. The parallels are exact and deliberate. Cinematic oil painting on the left, photographic realism on the right. 16.9 widescreen. SFX. On the left, the dry desert wind of ancient Mesopotamia. On the right, the same dry wind in a modern setting. The sounds identical across 4,000 years. We have travelled across 4,000 years of human history and 5 continents of human geography, and we have told the same story each time we arrived somewhere new. The story of what happens when the rains stop. It would be convenient to conclude that these are ancient stories, cautionary tales from civilizations sufficiently remote in time that we can treat their experiences as historical curiosities rather than warnings. But the climatic systems that failed these civilizations are the same systems that sustain modern agriculture. The aquifers that are being depleted across the American West, the Indian subcontinent, and the Middle East are the same water reserves that ancient civilizations drew on. The monsoons that are shifting in response to modern climate change are the same monsoons whose shifting destroyed Angkor and the Tang Dynasty. The distance between us and these collapsed civilizations is temporal. The distance between their vulnerabilities and ours is far smaller than our modern confidence suggests. Visual, a montage of current global water stress. The shrinking surface of the Aral Sea shown in a series of time-lapse images, the retreating glaciers of the Himalayas that feed the great Asian rivers, the depleted water levels of Lake Mead behind Hoover Dam, the dried agricultural land of the Syrian crisis region, current photographs rendered in cinematic colour, their documentary truth unadorned. 16.9 widescreen. SFX. The sounds of modern water stress. The hum of a groundwater pump working harder to reach deeper water. The sound of a dried riverbed. The distant sound of political argument. The cry of a child in a water queue. Sounds that belong to the present century. The Fertile Crescent. The same region where the Akkadian Empire built its grain wealth, where the world's first cities rose on the surplus generated by reliable Mesopotamian rainfall, is experiencing what climate scientists describe as one of the most severe and sustained droughts in the instrumental record. Syria's 2006 to 2010 drought, which drove approximately 1.5 million rural people into urban areas and contributed to the social pressures that produced the Syrian civil war, is now studied by climate scientists as a case study in the contemporary relationship between drought and political instability. The mechanisms were familiar. Agricultural failure generating migration, migration generating urban pressure generating social stress meeting political dysfunction in a system with inadequate adaptive capacity. The drought didn't cause the Syrian war, but it loaded the gun. The same language we used for the Sea Peoples, the same underlying mechanism. Visual, a map of the Fertile Crescent overlaid with drought severity data from 2006-2010, the colour coding showing the intensity of the drought across the agricultural heartland of Syria, then a second overlay showing the migration patterns from rural to urban areas, then a third showing the geography of the subsequent conflict, the 3 overlays accumulating. Documentary visualization, precise and sobering. 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the quiet of a data visualization, a computer processing, graphs updating. Then, under the silence of the data, a faint sound of a city in conflict, carried on distant wind, present tense sounds from a present tense crisis. In the American West, a drought that climate scientists now call the megadrought has been running since the early 2000s, the driest period in that region in at least 200 years, according to a 2022 study in the journal Nature Climate Change. Lake Mead, the reservoir behind Hoover Dam that supplies water to roughly 40 million people across 7 states, reached its lowest water level since the dam was completed in the 1930s. The Colorado River, which supplies this water, now rarely reaches the Gulf of California at all, its flow fully consumed by agricultural and municipal users long before it reaches the sea. The ancient civilizations of the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans of Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde, collapsed under the Great Drought of the late 13th century. The scale of the modern water management infrastructure in the same region is incomparably greater, but the fundamental dependency, complex large-scale human settlement in a semi-arid region, relying on water supplies that are increasingly uncertain, is the same. Visual, Lake Mead at current low water levels, the distinctive white bathtub ring of mineral deposits marking the former high water mark far above the current surface. A marina visible in the foreground with docks that now rest on dry ground far above the water. The scale of the water loss immediately legible. Cinematic wide angle, 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the sound of the modern West. A warm wind across exposed lake bed, the distant sound of a boat engine on the diminished water, the creak of a dock above the waterline, the sounds of a landscape adapting uncertainly to less water. The Asian monsoon system, which feeds the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Mekong, the Irrawaddy, and the great rivers of China, sustaining agricultural systems that feed roughly half of humanity, is showing signs of significant change under climate pressure. The monsoon's timing, intensity, and spatial distribution are all shifting in ways that are proving difficult to predict with confidence and impossible to plan around with certainty. The Khmer civilization fell when the monsoon became unreliable. The Tang Dynasty fell when the monsoon weakened over the Yellow River basin. The ancient cultures of the Indus Valley contracted when the monsoon shifted, and the rivers they depended on changed their behaviour. Today, more than 3 billion people live within the monsoon-dependent agricultural systems of South and Southeast Asia. The stakes of monsoon variability have never been higher, and the adaptive capacity of the communities most dependent on monsoon reliability, subsistence farmers in South Asia, smallholder rice cultivators in Southeast Asia, is, in fundamental ways, not so different from the farmers of ancient Angkor. Visual, a montage of South and Southeast Asian agricultural communities during monsoon season. The extraordinary spectacle of a full monsoon arriving, the rain sheeting across rice paddies, the rivers running full, the celebrations of farmers for whom this moment is everything, the beauty and the absolute dependency of the scene, cinematic photography, the colour extraordinary. 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the arrival of the monsoon, that extraordinary sound heard across South Asia of rain falling on baked earth for the first time in months, the collective human sound of relief, the celebration, the thank-offering, the sounds of dependency relieved for another year. None of this is to argue for despair. The ancient civilizations we have examined did not have access to modern climate science, modern agricultural technology, modern water management engineering, modern communication systems, or modern international cooperation mechanisms. We do. We know, in ways they could not, that the climate is changing and that water stress is increasing across the most densely populated agricultural regions of the world. We have the modelling capacity to project how these changes will unfold. We have the engineering capacity to build infrastructure, desalination plants, efficient irrigation systems, drought-resistant crop varieties, water recycling systems that can extend the range of sustainable human settlement beyond what was possible for ancient civilizations. And we have the historical record we have spent this documentary examining. The deep, multi-civilization pattern of how drought interacts with complex societies, how the failures cascade, where the vulnerabilities concentrate, what adaptive strategies have worked, and what has failed. Visual, a montage of modern water innovation, a desalination plant on the Israeli coast, precision drip irrigation in an Israeli desert agricultural project, a team of researchers working with drought-resistant crop varieties in sub-Saharan Africa, a modern water recycling facility in Singapore, a remote sensing team analysing drought patterns from satellite data, the footage of human ingenuity and scientific application, 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the sounds of modern innovation, the hum of a desalination plant, the drip of precision irrigation, the discussion of researchers, the quiet of satellite data being processed, the sounds of human intelligence being applied to an ancient problem. What the ancient collapses teach us is not that drought inevitably destroys civilization, it is that drought exploits specific predictable vulnerabilities, overcalibration to normal conditions, legitimacy systems that cannot absorb climate shocks, infrastructure that requires constant maintenance but is neglected under stress, elite competition that intensifies as resources contract, and the non-linear fragility of systems that appear robust until suddenly they are not. These vulnerabilities are not unique to ancient civilizations. They exist in every complex society organized around agricultural surplus in a variable climate. The question is whether we act on what the historical record is telling us before the vulnerabilities are tested, or whether we wait, as the Akkadians waited, as the Maya waited, as the Khmer waited for the year the river stops, and discover in the worst possible way that our confidence in the permanence of abundance was misplaced. Visual. A final wide shot of the Euphrates River, the ancient river running through the same landscape where civilization first arose, its current flow diminished from historical levels, but still there, a farmer on the bank. The same scene, in essence, that opened this documentary 4,000 years of history ago, the river as the thread connecting all of human civilization's water dependency across time. Cinematic oil painting, the light warm and beautiful and uncertain. 16:9 widescreen. SFX, the Euphrates, the sound of the most historically significant river in the world, running through its ancient course, water, moving, not yet stopped, the sound of something precious and uncertain, the sound at the centre of everything. Epilogue, the cracked earth remembers. Visual, return to the image from the cold open, the dried riverbed, the cracked clay earth split into hexagonal plates, the dead white tree at the centre, exactly as we left it. But now the camera moves differently, slower, with more recognition, as if we are seeing a familiar place through changed eyes. Cinematic oil painting, the light the same warm gold of the opening. 16:9 widescreen, SFX. The same sounds as the cold open. Deep silence, then the low dry wind, then the distant child's voice calling a name. But now we listen differently. We began with a farmer in the Euphrates Valley, 4,000 years ago, walking to his irrigation channel in the morning and finding it dry. We end with the same image. Not because nothing has changed, everything has changed, but because the essential scene has not. Somewhere in the world, on this day as you hear these words, a farmer is walking to a water source that was reliable last year and finding it less reliable now. Somewhere, an administrator is looking at reservoir levels and doing arithmetic that does not produce reassuring numbers. Somewhere, a community is having the same quiet, desperate conversations that the administrators of Tel Leilan had 4,000 years ago, in cuneiform on clay tablets. The rains did not come. What do we do? Visual, a montage of farmers and water, a Syrian farmer at a dry well, an Indian farmer watching a tank level, a Californian irrigator at a reduced canal, a Kenyan woman carrying water from an increasingly distant source, a Bolivian farmer watching a retreating glacier that has been feeding her river for generations. People in every part of the world, in every kind of light, performing variations of the same ancient observation. The water is less, cinematic wide angle, the humanity of each face central to the frame. 16:9 widescreen. SFX, different water sounds from each location, a well being lowered into decreasing depth, the quiet of a diminished tank, the reduced sound of a canal, footsteps on a path to water, the variations on an ancient theme. The civilizations we have visited in this documentary, Akkadian, Mycenaean, Maya, Khmer, Ancestral Puebloan, Tang, Harappan, Old Kingdom Egyptian, Tiwanaku, were not failures. They were successes, extraordinary ones that lasted for centuries or millennia, and produced art and knowledge and ways of living that shaped everything that followed them. They were brought down not by any deficiency of intelligence, creativity, or determination. They were brought down by the fundamental constraint that underlies all of human civilization. We are water-dependent organisms, and so is everything we grow, and so is everything we build, and so is everything we call civilization. This is not a tragedy in the sense of a moral failing. It is a tragedy in the Greek sense, the working out of necessary consequences from inescapable premises. Visual, a gallery of images from the civilizations in this documentary, each represented by a single, emblematic visual at its peak: the bronze head of Naram-Sin, the lion gate of Mycenae, a Maya king on a carved stele, the 5 towers of Angkor Wat reflected in its moat, Pueblo Bonito from above, the Tang court at Chang'an, the great bath of Mohenjo-Daro, the pyramids of Giza, the gateway of the sun at Tiwanaku, 9 civilizations, 9 peaks of human achievement, each image held for just a moment, each beautiful, each gone, 16.9 widescreen. SFX, 9 brief musical phrases, each characteristic of the civilization shown, each played for just a few seconds. Mesopotamian reed flute, Greek lyre, Maya drum, Southeast Asian gamelan, Native American flute, Chinese erhu, South Asian sitar, Egyptian harp, Andean panpipes, each phrase brief, complete, and then finished, a museum of sounds. The cracked earth does not mourn. It does not know that civilizations rose and fell above it. It records what the sky provided and what the sky withheld, in the chemistry of its sediment layers and the annual growth rings of its trees and the calcium layers of its cave formations, keeping a patient, meticulous, incorruptible record that humans are only now beginning to read. What that record tells us, in letters written in oxygen isotope ratios and pollen samples and aeolian dust layers, is that the climate has always changed. It changed before human civilization existed. It will change after human civilization ends, in whatever form it eventually takes. The question was never whether the climate would change. The question has always been, what do we do when it does? Visual. The camera rises slowly above the cracked riverbed of the cold open, pulling back and back and back, the dead tree growing small, the pattern of cracked earth resolving into a broader landscape, the broader landscape revealing itself as one small part of a continent, the continent one small part of a world. The pale blue dot, seen from a great distance, then the camera stops and holds. 16.9 widescreen. SFX. The sound of the earth is heard from space, which is to say silence, but under the silence, barely audible, the sounds of all the civilizations in this documentary, playing simultaneously at the lowest possible volume. Not cacophony, but resonance. All those different water sounds and music sounds and human sounds, all there at once. The full orchestra of human history played so quietly it can almost be felt rather than heard. The farmer in the Euphrates Valley, walking to his dry channel 4,000 years ago, was not the first person in history to face this moment. His predecessors had faced it in other valleys, under other skies, in other ages of the world's long story. And he would not be the last. Every generation that comes after us will face some version of that morning walk to the channel. The question that each generation must answer, that we must answer now, with the full knowledge of what the historical record tells us, is whether we have built systems capable of surviving what the sky decides to give us, or whether we have made the same confident assumption, understandable in every previous civilization that made it, that the abundance we have known is the abundance we are entitled to. The river does not owe us its water. We have always known this. We have never quite believed it. Visual, back to the dead white tree at the center of the cracked riverbed. The camera holds on it. The tree does not move. The wind does not come. The image is still and vast and dry and waiting. 16.9 widescreen. SFX. Silence. Then from very far away the sound of water. Not certain, not close, but possible. The sound of rain, somewhere else, moving in this direction, growing slowly louder, still distant, still possible. The sound holds as the credits roll.